Hello everyone, welcome to Sleepy Crimes Hub. I'm here with you tonight to help you relax and slowly fall asleep. I know many of you are watching this video to rest your mind. So before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, take a deep breath and let go of the day. Let's gently begin with case 1. Ian Brady was born on January 2nd, 1938 in the Gorbals area of Glasgow, under the name Ian Duncan Stewart. His mother, Margaret Peggy Stewart, worked as a tea room waitress and was raising him alone. The identity of his father was never clearly confirmed. According to his mother, he had been a journalist for a Glasgow newspaper who died shortly before Ian's birth. Peggy had very little support and struggled to care for her child on her own. After a short time, she made the difficult decision to place Ian in the care of a local couple, Mary and John Sloan, who were already raising children of their own. From that point on, Ian took their surname and became known as Ian Sloan. Although he no longer lived with her, his mother did not disappear from his life. She continued to visit him throughout his childhood, remaining a quiet but constant presence as he grew up in a home that was no longer truly his own. During his childhood, Brady took a family trip to Loch Lomond, an experience that reportedly sparked a strong connection to the outdoors. Not long after, the family relocated to a council house on an overspill estate in Pollock, marking another quiet but significant shift in his early life. As the years passed, darker stories began to surround him. Several writers later claimed that Brady showed cruelty toward animals while still young. Accounts described him openly bragging about killing a cat and later harming other animals in brutal ways. Brady himself firmly rejected these accusations, denying that he had ever abused animals. His behavior became more troubling once he began attending Shawlands Academy, a school intended for academically capable students. During his teenage years, he appeared before a juvenile court on more than one occasion for breaking into houses. Eventually, he left school and entered working life, first taking a low-level job at a shipyard in Govan, then later working as a messenger for a butcher. Around this time, Brady was involved in a relationship with a young woman named Evelyn Grant. The relationship ended abruptly after he threatened her with a knife following her attendance at a dance with another boy. This incident brought him back into the legal system once again, this time facing multiple charges. Soon after, he was placed on probation, with the condition that he return to live with his mother. By then, his mother had moved to Manchester and remarried an Irish fruit merchant named Patrick Brady. Patrick arranged work for Ian at Smithfield Market, and from that point on, Ian adopted his stepfather's surname, the name by which he would later become known. Not long after settling in Manchester, Brady found himself in trouble again. He was caught attempting to smuggle a sack filled with stolen lead seals out of the market. The incident led to a short spell in Strangeways prison. Because he was still legally a minor, the court later sent him to a borstal, officially described as a place for training. His time in custody moved him between several institutions. He was first sent to Latchmere House in London, then transferred to Hatfield Borstal in Yorkshire. While there, he was discovered intoxicated on alcohol he had brewed himself, an offense that resulted in his transfer to a far harsher unit in Hull. When Brady was released on November 14, 1957, he returned once more to Manchester. Freedom, however, did not bring stability. He took on manual labor that he openly disliked and was soon dismissed from another job at a brewery. Frustrated but determined to change his situation, he made a quiet decision to educate himself. From a local public library, Brady borrowed instructional manuals on bookkeeping. Alone in his room, he spent long hours studying in silence, an effort that reportedly surprised those around him, who had never seen such discipline or focus from him before. In January 1959, Brady applied for a clerical position at Millward's Merchandising, a wholesale chemical distribution company based in Gorton, and was accepted. To those who worked alongside him, he appeared quiet and reliable, always on time and largely keeping to himself. Yet beneath that calm exterior, colleagues also noticed a sharp temper that surfaced without much warning. Outside of work, Brady spent much of his time reading. His choice of books was unsettling. He studied language manuals, including guides to learning German, and immersed himself in writings linked to Nazi ideology and accounts of wartime atrocities. He was also drawn to the life and philosophy of the French writer Marquis de Sade, whose ideas would later give rise to the term associated with cruelty and suffering. Brady often rode his Tiger Cub motorcycle, using it to escape the city and travel into the remote landscapes of the Pennines. These solitary journeys into open, desolate countryside became a regular part of his routine. Moments of isolation that contrasted sharply with his otherwise controlled, inward-facing life. Myra Hindley was born on July 23, 1942 in Crumpsall, the daughter of Bob and Nellie Hindley. She grew up in Gorton, a working-class area of Manchester at the time, where rows of Victorian slum houses shaped much of the childhood environment. Her father struggled with alcoholism and was often violent, creating a tense and fearful atmosphere in the home. The family's living conditions were cramped and uncomfortable. Myra was forced to share a single bed, squeezed next to her parents' double bed, leaving little room for comfort or privacy. The situation became even more challenging with the birth of her younger sister, Maureen, in August 1946. Around that time, when Myra was just a young child, she was sent to live nearby with her grandmother, offering a small respite from the hardships of her home life. During the Second World War, Myra Hindley's father had served with the Parachute Regiment, seeing action in North Africa, Cyprus, and Italy. Known as a strict and unyielding man in the army, he expected the same toughness from his daughter. From a young age, he taught her to fight, insisting that she defend herself under any circumstances. When Myra was around 8, a local boy scratched her cheeks, drawing blood. Terrified and in tears, she ran to her father for guidance. Instead of comforting her, he threatened to punish her if she didn't strike back. Determined to follow his command, Myra sought out the boy and landed a series of punches, knocking him down. Years later, she would describe it as her first taste of victory. At 8 years old, I'd scored my first victory. Experts studying her later life have suggested that this relationship with her father left a lasting mark. As Malcolm McCulloch, a professor of forensic psychiatry, noted, she was not only accustomed to violence at home, but was actively rewarded for using it elsewhere. Experiences like this, beginning so young, can profoundly shape a person's perception of aggression and retaliation, leaving traces that can last a lifetime. In June 1957, one of Myra Hindley's closest friends, Michael Higgins, invited her to go swimming at a nearby, disused reservoir with a group of friends. For reasons she would later recall with regret, she decided not to go and went out with another companion instead. Tragically, Michael drowned that day. The incident affected Hindley deeply. Even though she was a capable swimmer herself, she blamed herself for not being there. Stricken with guilt, she organized a collection for a reef and attended his funeral, which was held at St. Francis's Monastery on Gorton Lane. The loss left a lasting impression, a shadow that would linger over her early adolescence. The monastery where Myra Hindley had been baptized as a Catholic shortly after her birth in 1942 left a subtle but lasting impression on her. Her father had insisted on a baptism, and her mother had agreed, on the condition that Myra not be sent to a Catholic school, believing that all the monks taught was the catechism. As she grew older, Hindley found herself increasingly drawn to the Roman Catholic Church. After beginning her studies at Ryder Secondary Modern, she started formal instruction for reception into the church, a path she pursued soon after the tragic death of her friend Michael Higgins. She chose the confirmation name Veronica and later celebrated her first communion in November 1958, marking a period of religious devotion that would become a defining part of her early adolescence. Myra Hindley's first job was as a junior clerk at a local electrical engineering firm. Her duties were simple: running errands, typing, and making tea. She was well liked by her colleagues, so much so that when she lost her first week's wage, the other women kindly took up a collection to replace it. By the time she was 17, Hindley had become engaged after a brief courtship. However, she called off the engagement just a few months later, believing the young man was immature and could not offer the life she desired. In her free time, Hindley pursued weekly judo lessons at a local school, though she quickly gained a reputation for holding on too tightly, leaving many partners hesitant to train with her. She later took a job at Bratby and Hincliffe, another engineering firm in Gorton, but was dismissed after 6 months due to repeated absences. By January 1961, 18-year-old Myra Hindley had joined Millwards as a typist. It wasn't long before she became intrigued by Ian Brady, a man who would soon dominate her thoughts. Around this time, she began keeping a personal diary. Though she went on dates with other men, her entries reveal a growing fascination with Brady. She finally spoke to him for the first time on July 27th, marking the start of a quiet but intense interest. Over the following months, her diary chronicled the ups and downs of her feelings, moments of curiosity, doubt, and fascination. By December 22nd, Brady asked her out on a date to the cinema, a small step that would gradually pull their lives together in ways neither could have anticipated. Brady and Hindley quickly fell into a pattern in their budding relationship. Their dates often began with a trip to the cinema, where they frequently watched X-rated films before returning to Hindley's home to share German wine. Brady also introduced Hindley to reading material, and during lunch breaks at work, the two would read aloud together from accounts of Nazi atrocities, a shared fascination that would come to influence Hindley's sense of identity. She began to adopt a striking new appearance, bleaching her hair blonde and wearing bold crimson lipstick, embodying the ideal of Aryan perfection she had grown obsessed with. Yet, even amid her infatuation, she occasionally expressed doubts about Brady. In a letter to a childhood friend, she described an unsettling incident where Brady had drugged her, though she also wrote of her intense obsession with him. Within months, she asked her friend to destroy the letter, attempting to bury evidence of her conflicted feelings. Later, reflecting on the power Brady held over her, Hindley wrote in a 30,000-word plea for parole. Within months, he had convinced me that there was no God at all. He could have told me that the earth was flat, the moon was made of green cheese, and the sun rose in the west. I would have believed him. Such was his power of persuasion. As their relationship deepened, Hindley began to radically transform her appearance. She adopted a style that was striking and provocative for the time. High boots, short skirts, and leather jackets, a reflection of the darker persona she was developing alongside Brady. Both of them grew increasingly withdrawn from colleagues, keeping to themselves and their shared obsessions. The couple spent hours at the library, borrowing books on philosophy, as well as crime and torture. Their reading included the works of Marquis de Sade, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. These texts became the backbone of their conversations, shaping the twisted ideals they were beginning to cultivate together. Although Hindley had not yet mastered driving, failing her test multiple times before finally passing on November 7, 1963, she often hired a van. In these rented vehicles, the pair would make their first tentative plans for criminal activity, including bank robberies, foreshadowing the darker acts that were to follow. Hindley developed a friendship with George Clitheroe, the president of the Cheadle Rifle Club, and visited local shooting ranges on several occasions. Though Clitheroe was puzzled by her sudden interest, he arranged for her to purchase a .22 rifle from a Manchester gun merchant. She also attempted to join a pistol club, but her poor aim and reportedly sharp temper led Clitheroe to conclude she was unsuitable. Undeterred, she later acquired a Webley .45 and a Smith & Wesson .38 through other members of the club. While Brady and Hindley's early plans for robbery never came to fruition, their attention shifted toward photography. Brady, who already owned a box Brownie, used it to take photographs of Hindley and her dog, Puppet. Eventually, they upgraded to a more sophisticated camera and purchased lights and darkroom equipment. The pair began taking photographs of one another that, at the time, would have been considered explicit, a sharp departure from Hindley's earlier, more reserved and shy demeanor. This marked a profound change in her personality, hinting at the darker, more daring aspects of her character that would later define their partnership. Hindley later recalled that, around the beginning of July 1963, Brady began speaking to her about committing the perfect murder. He often referenced Meyer Levin's Compulsion, a novel inspired by the infamous Leopold and Loeb case. The story told of two privileged young men who planned the perfect killing of a 12-year-old boy and avoided the death penalty due to their youth. A tale that would deeply influence Brady and, eventually, Henley W.Y. this time. Brady had moved in with Henley at her grandmother's house on Bannock Street, Gordon. On July 12th, they committed their first murder, 16-year-old Pauline Reed. Reed had attended school with Henley's younger sister, Maureen, and had briefly dated a local teenager, David Smith, who had several minor criminal convictions. When Reed went missing, no one had seen her immediately beforehand. Police questioned several people, including Smith, but he was cleared of any involvement. Brady and Henley, however, were not among those questioned, and the crime remained unsolved at that time. Their next victim was 12-year-old John Kilbride, who was lured away from a market in Ashton-under-Lyne on November 23rd. He was taken to Saddleworth Moor, where Brady and Henley murdered him and buried his body in the remote landscape. The disappearance sparked a massive search. Over 700 statements were taken, and 500 missing posters were printed. 8 days after Kilbride failed to return home, 2,000 volunteers combed the waste ground and derelict buildings of the town in a desperate attempt to find him. In the days following his disappearance, Henley hired vehicles, first in the week after Kilbride went missing, and again on December 21st, seemingly to check that their burial sites at Saddleworth Moor remained undisturbed. In early 1964, she purchased a second-hand Austin Traveler, which she soon exchanged for a mini pickup, a practical vehicle for their grim excursions into the moorland. Keith Bennett, also 12, disappeared in the Longside area of Manchester on June 16, 1964. In the aftermath, suspicion fell on his stepfather, Jimmy Johnson, who was questioned by police on 4 separate occasions over the following 2 years. Detectives even searched beneath the floorboards of the family home, and when they discovered that the row of houses was interconnected, the search expanded to cover the entire street. Yet the boys' whereabouts remained a mystery. Meanwhile, Maureen Henley, Myra's younger sister, married David Smith on August 15, 1964. The marriage was rushed, taking place at a register office, with no family in attendance. Henley disapproved of the union, and her mother felt embarrassed. Maureen, just 18, was 7 months pregnant, while Smith was only 16. The young couple initially moved into Smith's father's home in Ancoats, but they were soon relocated to a flat in a tower block on the Hattersley-over-Spill estate, starting their own troubled chapter of life. The day after Maureen Henley's wedding, Brady suggested that the 4 of them take a day trip to Windermere. It was the first time Brady and David Smith had really met, and he seemed impressed by the young man's demeanor. During the day, the two discussed society, the distribution of wealth, and even the possibility of robbing a bank. Smith, in turn, was taken with Brady, who generously paid for their food and wine throughout the outing. This trip into the Lake District would become the first of many excursions together. Henley, while apparently jealous of the bond forming between Brady and her sister, grew closer to Maureen during the day. A subtle shift in family dynamics that reflected the increasingly tangled relationships at the heart of their group. By 1964, Brady, Henley, and Henley's grandmother had been rehoused as part of Manchester's post-war slum clearance program. They moved to 16 Wardle Brook Avenue, a newly built council house on the Hattersley-over-Spill estate, near the Cheshire town of Hyde. To their new home, Brady and Henley became friendly with Patricia Hodges, the 11-year-old daughter of a neighbor. Hodges often accompanied the couple on trips to Saddleworth Moor to collect peat, a common practice among residents trying to improve the clay-heavy soil in their gardens. Despite spending time together in these remote areas, Brady and Henley never harmed Hodges, likely aware that her proximity, living just a few doors away, would make any disappearance far too risky to conceal. Early on Boxing Day 1964, Henley left her grandmother at a relative's home and did not allow her back to Wardle Brook Avenue that night. On the same day, 10-year-old Leslie and Downey vanished from a fun fair in Ancoats. Despite an extensive search, she could not be found. Downey's stepfather, Alan West, was repeatedly questioned by police, but no evidence linked him to her disappearance, which remained unsolved for almost a year. The following day, Hindley returned her grandmother to the house. By February 1965, Patricia Hodges had stopped visiting Wardlebrook Avenue, though David Smith remained a frequent visitor. Brady would give him books to read, and the two spent hours discussing robbery and murder, feeding the darker ideas that had begun to take hold. On Hindley's 23rd birthday in July 1965, her sister Maureen and David Smith, who until then had been living with relatives, were rehoused in Underwood Court, a new multi-story block of flats near Wardlebrook Avenue. From that point on, the two couples began to see each other more often, though almost always on Brady's terms, cementing the disturbing dynamics that were taking shape. Many years later, Hindley claimed that her involvement in the killings was driven by fear and coercion. She said Brady had drugged her, blackmailed her with explicit photographs he had taken, and threatened to kill her sister, Maureen, if she disobeyed him. Hindley also alleged that, while driving back from Saddleworth Moor after the murder of Pauline Reed, Brady warned her that she would one day end up buried in the same grave as their victim, a statement she described as both a threat and a declaration of control. In 2008, her solicitor, Andrew McCooey, revealed that Hindley had spoken to him with stark self-condemnation. She told him that she believed she deserved the harshest possible punishment. In her own words, she said that her crime was worse than Brady's because she was the one who lured the children, and without her presence, they would never have entered the car. She said she had always regarded herself as more guilty than Brady, a judgment she carried with her for the rest of her life. That on July 12, 1963, Brady confided in Hindley that he wanted to carry out the perfect murder. After work, he instructed her to drive a borrowed van through the area while he followed on his motorcycle, planning to signal her with his headlight whenever he spotted a potential victim. As they drove down Gorton Lane, Brady flashed his light at a young girl, but Hindley refused to stop. She recognized the child as an 8-year-old neighbor of her mother and could not bring herself to approach her. Later, sometime after 7:30 p.m., Brady signaled Hindley for 16-year-old Pauline Reed, a schoolmate of Hindley's sister, Maureen. Reed was walking along Froxmore Street on her way to a dance. Hindley offered her a lift, setting in motion the tragic events that would mark their first murder. Hindley later gave conflicting accounts of how much responsibility she bore versus Brady in selecting Reed as their victim. She did, however, admit that part of her reasoning was pragmatic. She believed that the disappearance of a teenager would attract less attention than that of a young child, a chilling rationalization for what would become a horrifying crime. Once Pauline Reed was in the van, Hindley asked her to help search Saddleworth Moor for an expensive lost glove. Reed agreed, and they drove to the moor, unaware of the horrors to come. When Brady arrived on his motorcycle, Hindley told Reed that he would be assisting in the search. Hindley later claimed that she waited in the van while Brady led Reed onto the moor. About 30 minutes later, Brady returned alone and took Hindley to the spot where Reed lay severely injured. Her clothes were in disarray, and she had suffered deep, brutal cuts to her throat, including a 4-inch incision across her voice box, inflicted with extreme force. Her coat collar and a throat chain had been pushed into the wound. When Hindley asked if Brady had raped Reed, he reportedly replied, "Of course I did." Hindley stayed with Reed while Brady retrieved a spade he had hidden on an earlier visit, then returned to the van as Brady buried Reed. In his own accounts, Brady claimed that Hindley had been present during the attack and even participated in the sexual assault on the evening of November 23, 1963, at a market in Ashton-under-Lyne. Brady and Hindley approached 12-year-old John Kilbride and offered him a lift home, even promising him a bottle of sherry. Once Kilbride was safely inside Hindley's hired Ford Anglia, Brady suggested they make a small detour to their home to fetch the sherry, setting the stage for the events that would soon unfold. Shortly after, Brady proposed another detour, this time claiming they needed to search Saddleworth Moor for a glove that Hindley had supposedly lost. When they arrived at the remote moorland, Brady led Kilbride away, while Hindley remained behind in the car on the moor. Brady sexually assaulted 12-year-old John Kilbride before attempting to slit his throat with a 6-inch serrated blade. When that failed, he strangled the boy using a shoelace or piece of string. After the murder, Brady buried Kilbride in a shallow grave, hiding the evidence of his crime in the remote landscape. In a chilling demonstration of their macabre fascination, Brady later photographed Hindley and her dog standing atop the freshly disturbed earth, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had begun to take hold over their lives. Early on the evening of June 16, 1964, Hindley approached 12-year-old Keith Bennett, who was on his way to his grandmother's house in Longsight, asking for help loading some boxes into her Mini. She then offered to drive him home. Brady, meanwhile, sat in the back of the van. Hindley drove to a lay-by on Saddleworth Moor, where Brady led Bennett away, claiming they were searching for a lost glove. About 30 minutes later, Brady returned alone, carrying a spade he had hidden earlier. When Hindley asked what had happened, Brady told her that he had sexually assaulted Bennett and strangled him with a piece of string, marking another tragic chapter in their growing pattern of violence. That on December 26, 1964, Brady and Hindley attended a fun fair in Ancoats, where they noticed 10-year-old Leslie and Downey seemingly alone. The pair deliberately dropped some shopping they were carrying, creating an excuse to ask her for help in carrying the packages to their car, and eventually back to Wardlebrook Avenue. Once inside the house, Downey was undressed, gagged, and forcibly posed for photographs. She was then raped and murdered, possibly strangled with a piece of string. This brutal act marked yet another tragic escalation in the pair's crimes, highlighting the chilling combination of calculated manipulation and violence that defined their relationship. The attack was recorded on a reel-to-reel tape, capturing both Brady and Hindley's voices as their victim screamed and pleaded for mercy. Hindley later claimed that she had gone to run a bath for Downey and discovered her dead upon returning, while Brady asserted that it was Hindley who had carried out the murder. The following morning, the pair drove Downey's body to Saddleworth Moor, where they buried her in a shallow grave, naked, with her clothes neatly placed at her feet, a grim ritual that reflected the disturbing control and methodical nature of their crimes. That on the evening of October 6, 1965, Hindley drove Brady to Manchester Central Railway Station and waited outside in the car while he looked for a victim. After a few minutes, Brady returned with 17-year-old Edward Evans, an apprentice engineer from Ardwick, whom he introduced to Hindley as his sister. Brady later claimed that he had selected Evans for a sexual encounter. The three of them drove back to Brady and Hindley's home on Wardlebrook Avenue, where they spent some time together, relaxing over a bottle of wine, unaware of the tragedy that would soon follow. At some point, Brady sent Hindley to fetch David Smith, her brother-in-law. Although Hindley's family had never approved of Maureen's marriage to Smith, Brady had been cultivating a friendship with him in development that increasingly worried Hindley. As she feared it might compromise their secrecy and safety, Hindley returned with Smith and instructed him to wait outside for her signal, which she would give by flashing a light. When the signal came, Smith knocked on the door and was met by Brady. Brady asked if he had come for the miniature wine bottles and then left them in the kitchen, saying he was going to collect the wine. Smith later recounted these events to the police, unaware of the dark plans that were unfolding behind the door. Smith waited for a moment, then suddenly heard a blood-curdling scream, high-pitched and terrifying. The screams continued, one after another, until he heard Hindley shout, "Dave, help him," in a loud, urgent voice. Rushing inside, Smith stood frozen in the living room, witnessing a shocking scene. A young boy lying with his head and shoulders on the couch, his legs on the floor, screaming in terror. Brady stood over him, straddling his legs, hatchet raised above his head. He struck the boy on the left side of his head with a forceful blow that sounded horrible and terrifying. Smith then saw Brady throttle the boy, Edward Evans, with a length of electrical cord. During the struggle, Brady sprained his ankle, and Evans' body was too heavy for Smith to move alone. The three wrapped the body in plastic sheeting and placed it in the spare bedroom, intending to dispose of it later, leaving a chilling reminder of the cruelty that had unfolded inside the house. After the murder of Edward Evans, David Smith agreed to return the following morning to help transport the body to the car, intending to dispose of it on Saddleworth Moor. He arrived home around 3 a.m., asking his wife to make a cup of tea. He drank it, then vomited, finally confiding in her what he had witnessed the night before. By 6:10 a.m., Having waited for daylight and armed with a screwdriver and a bread knife in case Brady attempted to intercept him, Smith went to a phone box on the estate and called the police. A police car soon arrived to pick him up and take him to a high police station, where he recounted the horrific events he had witnessed, setting in motion the arrest of Brady and Henley. Police Superintendent Bob Talbot of the Stalybridge Division arrived at Wardlebrook Avenue, accompanied by a detective sergeant. Disguised in a bread deliver man's overall over his uniform, Talbot asked Henley at the back door if her husband was home. Henley denied having a husband or that any man was in the house. Talbot then identified himself, and Henley led him into the living room, where Brady lay on a divan, writing to his employer about his ankle injury. Talbot explained that he was investigating an act of violence involving guns reported the previous evening. Henley denied any incident of violence and allowed the officers to look around. When police requested the key to the locked spare bedroom, she claimed it was at her workplace. However, after officers offered to accompany her to retrieve it, Brady instructed her to hand it over. Inside the bedroom, the police discovered Edward Evans' body, and Brady was immediately arrested on suspicion of murder. As he began to get dressed, he reportedly said, "Eddie and I had a row and the situation got out of hand," a chilling attempt to explain the horrific scene they had uncovered. Although Henley was not immediately arrested, she insisted on accompanying Brady to the police station, taking her dog with her. She refused to make any statement regarding Edward Evans' death, beyond claiming it had been an accident, and was allowed to return home on the condition that she come back the following day. In the days that followed, Henley visited her employer, requesting to be dismissed so she could claim unemployment benefits. On one of these visits, she discovered an envelope belonging to Brady and burned it in an ashtray. She later claimed that she did not open it, but suspected it contained plans for bank robberies, a small glimpse into the wider criminal mindset that she and Brady had cultivated in the days that followed. Police continued to uncover more evidence, growing increasingly convinced that Henley had been actively involved in the murder of Edward Evans, and possibly in the deaths of other victims as well. On October 11th, Henley was arrested and taken into custody. She was charged as an accessory to the murder of Evans and remanded at Risley Prison, marking the official start of her legal entanglement in the horrifying crimes she had committed alongside Brady. During a search of Wardlebrook Avenue, police discovered an old exercise book with the name John Kilbride written inside, raising suspicion that Brady and Henley had been involved in the unsolved disappearances of other children and teenagers. When questioned, Brady admitted that he and Evans had fought, but insisted that he and Smith had murdered Evans, claiming that Henley had only done what she had been told. David Smith also revealed that Brady had instructed him to return anything incriminating, such as dodgy books, which Brady then packed into suitcases. Smith had no idea what else was inside or where the suitcases might be, though he noted that Brady had a thing about railway stations. On October 15th, a search of left luggage offices led police to the suitcases at Manchester Central Station. An acclaimed ticket for the luggage was later found tucked inside Henley's prayer book, linking her directly to the hidden evidence that inside one of the suitcases, police discovered a chilling assortment of costumes, notes, photographs, and negatives. Among these were 9 pornographic photographs of a young girl, later identified as Leslie and Downey, naked with a scarf tied across her mouth. There was also a 16-minute audio recording of a girl identifying herself as Leslie and Weston, screaming, crying, and pleading to be allowed to return home to her mother. A haunting and heartbreaking piece of evidence that confirmed the depth of the crimes. Police asked Leslie and Downey's mother to examine the 2 photographs that were considered appropriate for viewing in order to confirm her daughter's identity. She was also asked to verify the voice on the recording, ensuring that it too belonged to her daughter. This heart-wrenching confirmation made clear the horrifying reality of the crimes Brady and Henley had committed as part of their inquiries. Officers spoke to Patricia Hodges, who had on several occasions been taken to Saddleworth Moor by Brady and Henley. She was able to point out the couple's favorite spots along the A635 road, giving the police valuable insight into the locations they used. Acting on this information, police began a search of the area, and on October 16th, they discovered an arm bone protruding from the peat. It was initially believed to belong to John Kilbride, but the following day it was identified as Leslie and Downey's. Her body was still visually identifiable, and her mother was able to confirm the clothing that had been buried alongside her, providing chilling confirmation of the crime scene. Among the items in the suitcase were photographs of the Moores, seemingly innocuous at first glance. Smith had told police that Brady had boasted of photographic proof of multiple murders, and investigators, noticing Brady's careful removal of these landscape images from the house, appealed to local residents for help in identifying the locations. On October 21st, their search led to the discovery of the badly decomposed body of John Kilbride, which was so deteriorated that his mother had to identify him by the clothing he was wearing. This grim discovery confirmed the tragic fate of one more of Brady and Hindley's victims and highlighted the calculated, methodical nature of their crimes. That on the same day, while already in custody for the murder of Edward Evans, Brady and Hindley were brought before Hyde Magistrates Court, facing charges in the murder of Leslie and Downey. Each appeared separately and was remanded in custody for a week. They made a brief 2-minute appearance on October 28th, after which they were once again remanded in custody as the investigation and preparations for trial continued. Investigating officers suspected that Brady and Hindley were responsible for the disappearance of other children and teenagers from areas in and around Manchester over the previous few years. The search for further victims continued for a time after the discovery of John Kilbride's body, but with winter approaching, the search was called off in November. Newspapers speculated on additional victims of the Moores murders, with Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett among the names suggested. Faced with the evidence of the tape recording, Brady admitted to taking the photographs of Leslie and Downey, but claimed that she had been brought to Wardlebrook Avenue by 2 men who later took her away alive. By December 2nd, Brady had been charged with the murders of Kilbride, Downey, and Evans, while Hindley was charged with the murders of Downey and Evans and as an accessory to the murder of Kilbride. At the committal hearing on December 6th, Brady faced charges for the murders of Evans, Kilbride, and Downey, and Hindley was charged with the murders of Evans and Downey, as well as harboring Brady, knowing he had killed Kilbride. The prosecution's opening statement was presented in chambers rather than in open court. The defense requested a similar arrangement, but was refused. Over 11 days in December, proceedings continued before 3 magistrates in Hyde, culminating in the committal of both Brady and Hindley for trial at Chester Assizes, setting the stage for the full legal reckoning of their crimes. Many of the photographs taken by Brady and Hindley on the moors included Hindley's dog, Puppet, sometimes pictured as a young puppy. To help date the images, detectives had a veterinary surgeon examine the dog to determine his age. Unfortunately, the examination required a general anesthetic, from which Puppet did not recover. Hindley was furious, accusing the police of having murdered her dog, one of the few times that detectives ever witnessed a genuine emotional response from her. In a letter to her mother, she wrote, "I feel as though my heart's been torn to pieces. I don't think anything could hurt me more than this has. The only consolation is that some moron might have got hold of Puppet and hurt him." This small glimpse of grief stood in stark contrast to the horrors surrounding the other evidence, offering a chilling insight into Hindley's complex character. The 14-day trial of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley began on April 19, 1966, in a specially prepared courtroom at Chester Assizes, presided over by Mr. Justice Finn Atkinson. Due to the public outrage over their crimes, the dock was fitted with bulletproof glass to protect the couple, amid fears that someone might attempt to harm them. Other elaborate security measures included a public address system costing £2,500 and telephone equipment costing £500. The trial drew intense attention from national and international journalists, who booked up most of Chester's hotel rooms. Onlookers traveled for hours to stand outside the courthouse each day, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous couple. Brady and Hindley faced charges for the murders of Edward Evans, Leslie and Downey, and John Kilbride. The Attorney General, Sir Elwyn Jones, led the prosecution, assisted by William Mars Jones. Brady was defended by Emlyn Hooson QC, a Liberal Member of Parliament, while Hindley was defended by Godfrey Heilpern QC, Recorder of Salford since 1964. Both were experienced Queen's Counsel, prepared to handle one of the most notorious cases in British criminal history. David Smith, Hindley's brother-in-law, served as the chief prosecution witness during the trial. In the weeks leading up to the proceedings, newspapers and magazines sought the rights to his story. The News of the World offered £1,000, while the American People magazine made a competing offer of £6,000, sums equivalent to roughly £20,000 and £140,000 today. Smith accepted the News of the World's offer, which included promises of additional payments for syndication and serialization. Until the trial, he received £15 weekly, with a £1,000 lump sum promised if Brady and Hindley were convicted. During the trial, the judge and the defense repeatedly questioned Smith and his wife about this financial arrangement. Initially, Smith refused to name the newspaper, risking contempt of court. When he eventually revealed it was the News of the World, the Attorney General, Sir Elwyn Jones, promised an investigation. Comparing Smith's testimony with his earlier statements to police, Mr. Justice Atkinson acknowledged the newspaper's actions as gross interference with the course of justice, but concluded that the financial incentive had not substantially affected the accuracy of his account. Jones later decided not to pursue charges against the newspaper for this interference. Both Brady and Hindley entered pleas of not guilty. During the trial, Brady testified for over 8 hours, while Hindley gave her account for 6 hours. Brady admitted to striking Edward Evans with an axe, but claimed that someone else had actually killed him, pointing to the pathologist's observation that Evans' death had been accelerated by strangulation, an apparent contradiction in the evidence. Observers noted that Brady's calm, undisguised arrogance and meticulous attention to detail did little to endear him to the jury. Hindley, for her part, denied any knowledge of the photographs of Saddleworth Moor discovered by police had been taken near the graves of their victims. The 16-minute audio recording of Leslie and Downey, on which both Brady and Hindley's voices were audible, was played in open court. Hindley admitted that her behavior towards Downey had been brusque and cruel, but claimed that this was only because she feared someone might hear the child's screams. She testified that when Downey was being undressed, she was downstairs. When the pornographic photographs were taken, she was looking out the window, and that when Downey was strangled, she was merely running a bath. That on May 6th, after just over 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Ian Brady was found guilty of all 3 murders, while Myra Hindley was found guilty of the murders of Leslie and Downey and Edward Evans. By this time, the death penalty for murder had been abolished, so the judge imposed the only sentence the law allowed: life imprisonment. Brady received 3 concurrent life sentences, while Hindley was given 2 concurrent life sentences, along with an additional 7-year term for harboring Brady while knowing he had murdered John Kilbride. Following sentencing, Brady was transferred to Durham Prison, and Hindley was sent to Holloway Prison, beginning the next chapter of their confinement for the crimes that had shocked the nation. In his closing remarks, Mr. Justice Atkinson described the murders as truly horrible and referred to the accused as 2 sadistic killers of the utmost depravity. He recommended that they should spend a very long time in prison before being considered for parole, though he did not set a specific minimum term. Under British law, anyone sentenced to life imprisonment could spend the rest of their natural life in prison, but might be released on parole under life license, with approval from the Home Secretary following recommendation by the parole board. Atkinson described Ian Brady as wicked beyond belief, noting that he saw no reasonable possibility of reform or suitability for parole. For Hindley, however, he suggested that she might one day be considered for parole once removed from Brady's influence. Throughout the trial, both Brady and Hindley stuck rigidly to a strategy of lying. Hindley, in particular, was later described as a quiet, controlled, and impassive witness who lied remorselessly, maintaining her composure even as the horrifying details of their crimes were presented in court. After the initial search of the moors began in October 1965, the national media were eager to speculate on other missing children and teenagers from the region who might have been victims of Brady and Hindley. Among those mentioned was Stephen Jennings, a 3-year-old boy from West Yorkshire who had disappeared in December 1962. His body was eventually discovered buried in a field in 1988, But the following year, his father, William Jennings, was found guilty of his murder. Another case that received attention was that of Jennifer Ty, a 14-year-old girl who vanished from a children's home in Oldham in December 1964. More than 40 years later, the press speculated that she might have been another victim of the Moors murders. However, in April 2010, Greater Manchester Police confirmed that Jennifer Ty was still alive, clearing her of any connection to Brady and Henley. This followed claims in 2004 that Henley had told an inmate she and Brady had killed a sixth victim, a teenage girl that in 1985, Brady allegedly confessed to journalist Fred Harrison, who worked for the Sunday People, that he had killed both Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. A revelation police had long suspected, given their proximity to Brady and Henley and the timeline of their disappearances in the early 1960s. As a result, Greater Manchester Police reopened the investigation, now led by Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Topping, head of GMP's Criminal Investigation Department, that on July 3, 1985, Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Topping visited Ian Brady, who was then being held at Gartree Prison in Leicestershire. Brady remained scornful and dismissive, refusing to acknowledge any confession to additional murders. Despite his attitude, police decided to resume their search of Saddleworth Moor, relying once again on the photographs taken by Brady and Henley to help identify potential burial sites. In November 1986, Keith Bennett's mother wrote a heartfelt letter to Henley, desperately seeking information about the fate of her son. Henley appeared to be genuinely moved by the appeal. In the letter, she wrote, "I'm a simple woman. I work in the kitchens of Christie's Hospital. It has taken me 5 weeks' labor to write this letter because it is so important to me that it is understood by you for what it is, a plea for help. Please, Miss Henley, help me that a few days after receiving the letter from Keith Bennett's mother, police visited Myra Henley, who was then held at Cookham Wood Prison in Kent. Although she refused to admit any personal involvement in the murders, she agreed to assist by examining photographs and maps to try to identify locations she had visited with Brady. Henley showed particular interest in images of the area around Holland Brown Knoll and Shiny Brook, but said it was impossible to be certain without physically returning to the moor. Despite concerns over security and threats against Henley, Home Secretary Douglas Hurd agreed with Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Topping that a visit to the moor would be worthwhile. Writing in 1989, Topping admitted feeling cynical about Henley's motives. While the letter for Bennett's mother may have influenced her, he believed that Henley, aware of Brady's precarious mental state, was more concerned that he might cooperate with police and gain public approval for himself. And on December 16, 1986, Henley made the first of 2 visits to assist police in the search of Saddleworth Moor. To ensure security, all roads onto the moor were closed, and 200 officers, some armed, patrolled the area. Henley, accompanied by her solicitor, left Cookham Wood Prison at 4:30 a.m., flew by helicopter from a nearby airfield, and then moved around the moor by vehicle and on foot until 3 p.m. She struggled to connect what she saw to her memories of the area and appeared nervous of the helicopters overhead. The press described the visit as a fiasco, a publicity stunt, and a mindless waste of money. But Detective Chief Superintendent Topping defended the operation, explaining that a thorough, systematic search of the moor could never have been conducted in private. On December 19, 1986, David Smith, then 38, spent about 4 hours on Saddleworth Moor, assisting police in identifying additional areas for their search. Meanwhile, Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Topping continued regular visits to Henley in prison, accompanied by her solicitor, Michael Fisher, and her spiritual counselor, Peter Timms, a former prison governor turned Methodist minister. On February 10, 1987, Henley formally confessed to her involvement in all 5 murders, though the confession was not made public for over a month. The tape recording of her statement lasted more than 17 hours, which Topping described as a very well worked out performance, in which Henley revealed only what she wanted him to know. He noted that in her account, she was never directly present at the killings, always positioned in the car, over a hill, in the bathroom, or, in the case of the Evans murder, in the kitchen. Topping later expressed doubt that Henley's reported remorse and rehabilitation were genuine. suspecting that her performance may have been a calculated attempt to improve her chances of parole. Police later visited Brady in prison and informed him of Henley's confession, which he initially dismissed as untrue. However, when officers confronted him with specific details Henley had provided about Edward Evans's abduction, Brady reconsidered his position and indicated that he was willing to confess as well, but only on the condition that he be immediately given the means to end his own life afterward. This demand was one the authorities could not legally or ethically fulfill, and as a result, no such arrangement was made. Around the same time, Keith Bennett's father, Jimmy Johnson, sent Henley another letter, once again pleading for her help in locating the body of his son. In it, he expressed understanding over the criticism surrounding her first visit. Henley, who had not replied to Johnson's initial letter, responded by thanking him for both and explaining that her lack of response the first time had been due to the negative publicity. She claimed that had Johnson written 14 years earlier, she would have confessed and assisted police, and she also praised Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Topping while thanking Johnson for his sincerity. Henley made her second visit to Saddleworth Moor in March 1987, this time under much higher security. She stayed overnight in Manchester at the flat of the police chief in charge of GMP training and visited the moor twice. She confirmed that the search areas, Holland Brown Knoll and Hoe Grain, were correct, though she could not locate the graves. She did, however, later recall that as Pauline Reed was being buried, she had been sitting nearby on a patch of grass, able to see the rocks of Holland Brown Knoll silhouetted against the night sky. In April 1987, news of Henley's confession became public, drawing intense media attention. Around this time, Lord Longford renewed his call for her parole, arguing that continuing her detention merely to satisfy mob emotion was unjust. Henley, persuaded by her solicitor Michael Fisher, issued a public statement explaining her previous denials of guilt, reflecting on her religious experiences in prison, and acknowledging the impact of Jimmy Johnson's letters. In the statement, she admitted the truth of her crimes, expressed that she saw no possibility of release, and clarified that her brother-in-law David Smith was not involved in any of the murders except that of Edward Evans. Over the following months, public attention on the search gradually waned, but Henley's clue had helped police focus on a specific area of Saddleworth Moor. On July 1st, after more than 100 days of searching, they discovered Pauline Reed's body, buried about 3 feet below the surface and roughly 100 yards from where Leslie and Downey had been found. By this time, Brady had been cooperating with police, and when he heard the news, he made a formal confession to Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Topping. In a statement to the press, he said he would assist the police in their search. He was brought to the moor on July 3rd, but became disoriented, blaming the changes to the landscape over the years. The search was called off at 3 p.m., by which time a large crowd of reporters and television crews had gathered on the moor. Detective Chief Superintendent Topping initially refused to allow Brady a second visit to the moor, and the official search was called off on August 24th. Brady was brought back to Saddleworth Moor on December 8th, claiming he could identify the burial site of Keith Bennett, though the boy's remains were never recovered. Shortly after his first visit, Brady wrote a letter to a BBC reporter offering vague details of 5 additional deaths he alleged involvement in: a man in Manchester's Piccadilly area, another victim on the moor, 2 in Scotland, and a woman whose body he claimed had been dumped in a canal. Police, unable to match these claims to any unsolved cases, concluded there was insufficient evidence to open a formal investigation. Henley, meanwhile, told Topping that she had no knowledge of these alleged killings. Although both Brady and Henley had confessed to the murders of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett, the Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, concluded that there was no benefit in holding a further trial, as both were already serving life sentences. The legal system could impose no additional punishment, and so the case was left without a new prosecution. In 2003, police launched Operation Maida and conducted another search of the moor for Keith Bennett's body, this time employing advanced technology, including a U.S. reconnaissance satellite capable of detecting soil disturbances. By mid-2009, Greater Manchester Police announced that all avenues had been exhausted and that only a major scientific breakthrough or new evidence could restart the search. Any further involvement by Brady would be limited to a virtual walkthrough of the moors using 3D modeling, rather than an in-person visit. Public donations funded a search by Welsh search and rescue volunteers in 2010. In 2012, it was alleged that Brady may have given the location of Bennett's body to a prison visitor, resulting in her arrest on suspicion of interfering with a burial, though charges were later dropped due to insufficient evidence. In 2017, police requested a court order to open 2 locked briefcases owned by Brady, hoping for clues, but the application was denied, as no prosecution was likely to follow that on September 30th, 2022. Greater Manchester Police launched a search of the moor for human remains after receiving information from amateur investigator and author Russell Edwards, who had reportedly discovered skull. After examining a photograph of a jawbone, police cautioned that it was far too early to be certain about the identity of the remains. By October 1st, officers reported that no additional remains had been found, and on October 7th, the search was officially concluded without any further discoveries. After his conviction, Brady was transferred to Durham Prison, where he requested to live in solitary confinement. He spent 19 years in mainstream prisons before being diagnosed as a psychopath in November 1985 and moved to the high-security Park Lane Hospital, now Ashworth Hospital, in Maghull, Merseyside. Brady made it clear that he never wished to be released. The trial judge recommended that Brady's life sentence should truly mean life, a position upheld by successive Home Secretaries. In 1982, the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Lane, remarked, "This is the case if ever there is to be one when a man should stay in prison till he dies." Following the November 2007 death of John Straffen, who had spent 55 years in prison for murdering 3 children, Brady became the longest-serving prisoner in England and Wales. Although he refused to work with Ashworth Hospital psychiatrists, he occasionally corresponded with outsiders, including Lord Longford, writer Colin Wilson, and journalists, subject to censorship. In a 2005 letter, he described the murders as merely an existential exercise of just over a year, which was concluded in December 1964, claiming that he and Hindley had thereafter shifted focus to armed robbery, preparing by acquiring guns and vehicles. Over several years of interaction with forensic psychologist Chris Cowley, including face-to-face meetings, Brady spoke of what he described as an aesthetic fascination with guns, despite never having used one to kill. He repeatedly complained about life at Ashworth Hospital, a place he openly despised. In 1999, his right wrist was broken during what Brady claimed was an unprovoked, hour-long assault by staff. Following the incident, he began a hunger strike. Although English law generally allows patients to refuse medical treatment, those detained under the Mental Health Act 1983 for treatment of a mental disorder do not have that right when treatment is deemed necessary. As a result, Brady was force-fed and transferred to another hospital after his health deteriorated. He later recovered, and in March 2000 sought a judicial review challenging the legality of the force-feeding decision, but permission was refused. During this period, Brady expressed a fixation on death, writing that while Hindley suffered from a potentially fatal brain condition, he himself had to struggle simply to die. He claimed he had reached the end of endurance, stating that his sole objective was death and describing his hunger strike as rational and deliberate, adding that he regretted not attempting it decades earlier and that he wished only to leave what he called a cesspit in a coffin. In 2001, Brady wrote The Gates of Janus, a book published by the American underground press Feral House. Framed as an analysis of serial murder and individual killers, the book caused widespread outrage when its release was announced in the United Kingdom, largely because it allowed a convicted serial killer to present his own interpretations of violence. In the book, Brady also described his friendship in prison with Graham Young, known as the Teacup Poisoner, noting that the two shared an admiration for Nazi Germany. According to forensic psychologist Chris Cowley, Brady expressed regret over Hindley's imprisonment and the long-term consequences of their actions, but not necessarily over the murders themselves. He rejected the idea of offering a public apology, believing it meaningless, and instead claimed to express remorse through actions rather than words. For 2 decades, Brady transcribed classical texts into Braille for blind readers, an activity that ended when authorities confiscated his translation machine, fearing it could be used as a weapon. On another occasion, he offered to donate one of his kidneys to anyone in need, but was prevented from doing so by officials. Writer Colin Wilson later suggested that it was precisely because these attempts at expressing remorse were repeatedly blocked that Brady began to seriously contemplate suicide. In 2006, prison officials intercepted a package sent to Brady by a female friend. Hidden inside a hollowed-out crime novel were 50 paracetamol tablets, raising further concerns about his deteriorating mental state and his ongoing preoccupation with death. At the end of 2005, Brady wrote to the mother of Keith Bennett, the only victim whose body had never been recovered. In the letter, she later said, Brady claimed that he could guide police to within roughly 20 yards of where her son was buried, but that the authorities would not permit him to do so. He did not mention Bennett by name, nor did he state that he could lead investigators directly to the grave itself. Instead, he spoke vaguely about the clarity of his memories, a choice of words that offered hope while stopping short of anything concrete. In 2012, Brady applied to be transferred back to prison, repeating his long-standing wish to end his life by starvation. At a mental health tribunal held in June the following year, he disputed his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, arguing instead that he suffered from a personality disorder. The tribunal rejected his application, with the judge concluding that Brady continued to suffer from a mental disorder of sufficient seriousness to justify his ongoing detention and treatment in a secure hospital setting. After receiving end-of-life care, Ian Brady died at Ashworth Hospital on May 15, 2017 from restrictive pulmonary disease. An inquest concluded that his death was from natural causes and that his previous hunger strikes had not contributed. On multiple occasions, Brady had refused food and fluids for more than 48 hours, requiring the temporary use of a nasogastric tube, though his body mass index was not considered a health concern. He was cremated privately, and his ashes were scattered at sea during the night. Henley lodged an appeal against her conviction immediately after her trial, but it was unsuccessful. She continued corresponding with Brady by letter until 1971, when she ended their relationship. Afterward, Henley developed a romantic relationship with one of her prison warders, Patricia Cairns. A former assistant governor noted that such relationships were not uncommon at Holloway at the time, with some officers forming relationships either with inmates or among themselves. Henley successfully petitioned to have her status reduced from a Category A to a Category B prisoner. This change allowed Governor Dorothy Wing to take her on a supervised walk around Hampstead Heath, part of an unofficial policy aimed at gradually reintroducing certain inmates to the outside world when deemed ready. The excursion provoked a media outcry and led to an official rebuke for Wing from the Home Secretary at the time, Robert Carr. With assistance from Patricia Cairns and the outside contacts of another inmate, Maxine Croft, Henley plotted a prison escape. The plan was foiled when impressions of the prison keys were discovered by an off-duty police officer. Cairns was subsequently sentenced to 6 years imprisonment for her role in the plot. Henley was initially informed that she should serve 25 years before being considered for parole, a recommendation confirmed by the Lord Chief Justice in 1982. In January 1985, however, Home Secretary Leon Britton extended her minimum term to 30 years. By this time, Henley professed to be a Reformed Catholic. Throughout this period, Downey's mother became the focal point of a campaign to prevent Henley's release. Until her death in February 1999, she actively engaged with the media, providing regular interviews whenever speculation arose regarding Henley's potential parole. In February 1985, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher intervened, writing to Britain to express her view that the proposed minimum sentences, 30 years for Henley and 40 for Brady, were far too lenient. She declared, "I do not think that either of these prisoners should ever be released from custody. Their crime was the most hideous and cruel in modern times." In 1987, Henley admitted that the plea for parole she had submitted to the Home Secretary 8 years earlier was, in her words, on the whole, a pack of lies, and to some reporters, her cooperation in the searches on Saddleworth Moor appeared a cynical gesture aimed at ingratiating herself to the parole authorities. By July 1990, following her admission that she had played a more active role in the murders than she had previously acknowledged, then Home Secretary David Waddington imposed a whole life order on Hindley. She was not notified of this decision until 1994, when a ruling by the law lords required the prison service to inform all life sentence prisoners of the minimum period they must serve before being eligible for parole. In 1996, the parole board recommended transferring Hindley to an open prison, but she rejected the proposal. In early 1998, she was moved to the medium-security High Point prison, although the law lords' ruling left open the theoretical possibility of eventual release. Between December 1997 and March 2000, Hindley lodged 3 separate appeals against her whole life order, arguing that she had reformed and no longer posed a danger to society. But each appeal was consistently rejected by the courts. In 2002, when another life sentence prisoner successfully challenged the Home Secretary's authority to set minimum terms, Hindley, along with hundreds of other prisoners whose tariffs have been extended by politicians, faced the prospect of imminent release. Supporters even began making preparations to provide her with a new identity. In response, Home Secretary David Blunkett instructed Greater Manchester Police to investigate potential new charges against Hindley to prevent her release. The inquiry, led by Superintendent Tony Brett, initially considered the possibility of charging her with the murders of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. However, government lawyers advised that, due to the Director of Public Prosecution's decision 15 years earlier, pursuing a new trial would likely be deemed an abuse of process, that on November 25, 2002, the law lords ruled that judges, rather than politicians, should determine the length of a criminal sentence, effectively stripping the Home Secretary of the power to set minimum terms. Just days earlier, on November 15th, Hindley, aged 60 and a lifelong chain smoker, died of bronchial pneumonia at West Suffolk Hospital. She had previously been diagnosed with angina in 1999 and had been hospitalized after suffering a brain aneurysm. Outside Cambridge Crematorium, camera crews were held rank and file behind steel barriers. Yet none of Hindley's relatives attended the small service, which was attended by only 8 to 10 people. The enduring public outrage over the murders was such that reportedly 20 local undertakers refused to handle her cremation. For months later, Hindley's ashes were scattered by her former partner, Patricia Cairns, less than 10 miles from Saddleworth Moor at Staley Bridge Country Park. The Manchester Evening News noted concerns that this might lead visitors to avoid the park or even commit acts of vandalism. David Smith became widely reviled by the people of Manchester for financially profiting from the murders, with some members of the public even suspecting him of having been directly involved. During the trial, Maureen, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, was attacked in the lift of the building where she and Smith lived. Their home was repeatedly vandalized. They received a steady stream of hate mail, and Maureen later wrote that she felt unable to let her children out of her sight when they were young. The Attorney General, Sir Elwyn Jones, faced political pressure to take action against the press after declining to prosecute the News of the World for paying Smith. Rather than legislating against checkbook journalism, Jones accepted the Press Council's offer to publish a Declaration of Principle in November 1966, which included rules prohibiting payments to or interviews with criminal witnesses. The News of the World promptly rejected the declaration, however, and the council lacked the authority to enforce it. After stabbing another man during a fight, an attack he later claimed was triggered by the abuse and hostility he had endured since the trial. David Smith was sentenced to 3 years in prison in 1969. That same year, his children were taken into the care of the local authority. Maureen moved from Underwood Court to a bedsit in another district and found work in a department store. She endured whispering campaigns and petitions calling for her removal from her estate and received no support from her family, as her mother had sided with Myra during the trial and did not re-establish contact until the early 1970s that upon his release, Smith moved in with a 15-year-old girl, who later became his second wife, and he regained custody of his 3 sons. Maureen reconciled with her mother and moved into a council property in Gordon. She divorced Smith in 1973 and later married a lorry driver, Bill Scott, with whom she had a daughter. In 1980, Maureen suffered a brain hemorrhage. Henley was permitted to visit her in hospital, but arrived an hour after her death. Sheila and Patrick Kilbride, who were by then divorced, attended Maureen's funeral expecting Henley might appear. Patrick mistakenly believed Bill Scott's daughter from a previous marriage was Henley and attempted to attack her. Shortly before her death at age 70, Sheila warned, "If she, Henley, ever comes out of jail, I'll kill her," a threat later echoed by her son Danny. In 1972, Smith was acquitted of the murder of his father, who had been terminally ill, but pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a 2-day detention sentence. He later remarried and moved to Lincolnshire with his 3 sons. Smith was formally exonerated of any participation in the murders following Henley's 1987 confession. In 2011, he co-authored Witness with biographer Carol and Lee and died of cancer in Ireland in 2012. But Reed's mother was admitted to Springfield Mental Hospital in Manchester and, heavily sedated, attended her daughter's funeral on August 7, 1987. 5 years after their son's murder, Sheila and Patrick Kilbride divorced. And West, mother of Leslie and Downey, died in February 1999 after a long battle with cancer. She had been at the forefront of the campaign to ensure Henley remained in prison, and doctors noted that the stress had contributed to the severity of her illness. Bennett's mother continued to visit Saddleworth Moor, where her son is believed to be buried, until her death from cancer in August 2012 at the age of 78. In 1987, Manchester City Council decided to demolish the house on Wardlebrook Avenue, where Brady and Henley had lived, and where Downey and Evans had been murdered, citing excessive media interest in the property, creating unpleasantness for residents. In November 2017, it was revealed that, without the knowledge of her family, some of Pauline Reed's remains, including her jawbone, had been kept at the University of Leeds by Greater Manchester Police. GMP issued an apology to the Reed family. In October 2018, her remains were reburied at her grave in Gorton Cemetery, Manchester. The photographs and audio recordings of the torture of Leslie and Downey, shown in court, along with the cold, nonchalant behavior of Brady and Henley, cemented their lasting notoriety. Brady, who maintained that he did not wish to be released, was rarely mentioned in the news. In contrast, Henley's persistent attempts to secure release kept her in the public eye as a figure of hatred, especially since she withheld confessions regarding the murders of Reed and Bennett for 20 years. Henley's role also defied societal expectations of women. Her betrayal of the maternal role reinforced public perceptions of her as inherently evil, making her a symbolic figure in moral panics about serial murder and pedophilia in the decades that followed. Her frequently reprinted mugshot, taken shortly after her arrest, has been described as reminiscent of the mythical Medusa and, according to author Helen Birch, has become synonymous with the idea of feminine evil. At the 1997 Sensation Art exhibition, the painting Myra sparked controversy as it reproduced Henley's mugshot shortly after her arrest using children's handprints. Given Henley's status as co-defendant in the first serial murder trial held since the abolition of the death penalty, themes of retribution were common among those determined that she should never be released from prison. Even Henley's mother insisted she should die in prison, partly out of concern for her safety. Some commentators went further, suggesting that of the two killers, Henley was the more evil. Lord Longford, a Catholic convert, campaigned to secure the release of celebrated criminals, Henley in particular, which earned him widespread derision from the public and the tabloid press. He described Henley as delightful and maintained that one could loathe people's actions without loathing their inherent personality, emphasizing that human nature was sacred even when behavior was appalling. Tabloid newspapers branded Longford a loony and a do-gooder for defending Henley, whom they portrayed as pure evil. Henley herself became a long-running source of sensational press coverage, with exaggerated stories about her cushy life at the so-called five-star Cookham Wood prison and alleged liaisons with prison staff and other inmates. The Moors murders have inspired multiple works in popular culture. Edward Gorey's book, The Loathsome Couple, Mead, 1977, drew on the case, as did the Manchester band The Smiths' song Suffer Little Children from their 1984 debut album. The murders were dramatized in two 2006 television productions, See No Evil, The Moors Murders, and Longford. Additionally, the Black Mirror episode White Bear was partially inspired by the case. Case 2, Let Me Explain. John Thomas Straffen was born on February 27, 1930 at Bordenkamp in Hampshire. He was the third of 6 children born to John and Elizabeth Straffen, née Morgan. He had one older brother and one older sister, as well as 3 younger sisters. At the time of his birth, Straffen's father was serving in the British Army, while his mother worked as a homemaker. When Straffen was 2 years old, his father was posted overseas, and the family relocated to British India, where they remained for 6 years. During this period, Straffen's early childhood appeared largely ordinary. According to later recollections by his mother, he showed no signs of intellectual disability or serious behavioral issues in his early years. This changed when Straffen contracted encephalitis at the age of 6, while still in India. Although he survived the illness, its effects were lasting. After his recovery, his family noticed a marked change in his personality and behavior. He began to display antisocial tendencies that had not been present before his illness. In March 1938, the family returned to the United Kingdom and settled in a suburb of Bath, Somerset. Shortly after their return, Straffen's father was discharged from the army, marking the end of the family's military life and the beginning of a more settled, but increasingly troubled, chapter in Straffen's development. After his family returned to England, Straffen's behavior began to deteriorate noticeably. He started committing minor thefts and was frequently absent from school without permission. Because of these issues, he was referred to a child guidance clinic in October 1938. 8 months later, Straffen appeared before a juvenile court for the first time after stealing a purse from a young girl. The court sentenced him to 2 years probation. However, during this period, his assigned probation officer discovered that Straffen had little understanding of basic moral concepts. He did not clearly grasp the difference between right and wrong, nor did he comprehend the meaning or purpose of probation at the time. The Straffen family was living in overcrowded accommodation. His mother, burdened with caring for 5 other children, had very little time or capacity to focus exclusively on Straffen's needs. As a result of these circumstances and growing concerns about his mental state, the probation officer referred Straffen to a psychiatrist. Following psychiatric evaluation, Straffen was formally diagnosed as a mentally defective individual, a classification used at the time to describe significant intellectual and cognitive impairment. In June 1940, the local council referred Straffen to St. Joseph's School in Sambourne, Warwickshire, a residential institution for children classified at the time as mentally defective. Authorities instructed that he remain in structured institutional care of this kind until he reached the age of 16. That same year, Straffen underwent a formal intellectual assessment. The results showed his IQ to be 58, with a measured mental age of approximately 6 years. Straffen remained at St. Joseph's School until 1942, when he was transferred to Basford Court School in Deptford, Worcestershire. At Basford Court, staff observations described him as a withdrawn and solitary child. He was also noted to harbor significant resentment toward the authorities for placing him in a controlled and highly structured environment. That a second intellectual assessment carried out in the mid-1940s indicated some developmental progress. His IQ score was revised upward to 64, and his mental age was reassessed at 9 years and 6 months. Despite this increase, Straffen continued to require institutional supervision and support. He remained at Basford Court School until March 1946. Straffen was released from Basford Court School shortly after his 16th birthday and returned to live with his family in Bath. That same year, he was examined by the local medical officer of health, who concluded that although Straffen might be capable of performing basic manual labor, he still met the criteria for certification under the Mental Deficiency Act. Following his release, Straffen held several short-term menial jobs, but struggled to maintain steady employment. Eventually, he secured a more stable position as a machinist in a clothing factory. This job lasted for approximately 10 months before he was made redundant in 1947. Soon after losing his employment, Straffen began breaking into unoccupied houses in the local area. He typically stole small, low-value items, though there is no evidence that he kept these objects for personal use or passed them on to others. Instead, he often hid the stolen items or discarded them entirely. Lacking close friendships or social connections, Straffen carried out these burglaries alone. That on July 27, 1947, a 13-year-old girl went to the police to report that she had been sexually assaulted by a blonde-haired teenager who introduced himself as John. According to her statement, the attacker suddenly restrained her, placing his hand firmly over her mouth to prevent her from screaming. As she struggled, he issued a chilling threat, whispering, "What would you do if I killed you? I have done it before." The threat deeply traumatized the victim, but despite her detailed account, police were unable to identify or locate the assailant at the time. No immediate arrest was made, and the case gradually faded from active investigation. It would only be years later, after Straffen committed further violent acts, that authorities would revisit this assault and begin to connect it to him, recognizing it as an early warning sign of the dangerous escalation that lay ahead. Despite the victim's account, the police were unable to identify or locate the attacker at the time, and the case remained unresolved. It would only be much later, after further investigations into Straffen's behavior, that authorities retrospectively linked him to the sexual assault. Approximately 6 weeks after this incident, Straffen's behavior escalated in a disturbing direction. He strangled 5 chickens belonging to the father of a teenage girl with whom he had recently had an argument. The act, seemingly minor on the surface, was later recognized as a troubling display of cruelty to animals, an early indicator of the violent tendencies that would continue to intensify. In the autumn of 1947, John Thomas Straffen was arrested for burglary. During questioning, he did not resist police inquiries and voluntarily confessed not only to the offense for which he had been arrested, but also to 13 additional burglaries, many of which investigators had not previously connected to a single suspect. His admissions revealed a consistent pattern of lone, opportunistic crimes committed over several months. Straffen was remanded in custody and, on October 10, 1947, was committed to HM Prison Horfield in Bristol under the provisions of the Mental Deficiency Act 1913. Official committal documents described him as not of violent or dangerous propensities, a classification that would later be viewed as tragically inaccurate. He remained at Horfield Prison for approximately 20 months. During this period, Straffen was examined by the prison's medical superintendent, who conducted a formal psychiatric assessment. Following this evaluation, Straffen was officially classified as intellectually disabled, reinforcing earlier diagnoses made during his childhood and adolescence. Despite this designation, he continued to be housed within the prison system rather than transferred to a long-term, secure medical institution. Straffen's time at Horfield was marked by isolation from other inmates, and he generally maintained good behavior. This apparent compliance led authorities, in July 1949, to transfer him to a lower-security agricultural hostel in Winchester, a setting designed to prepare mentally disabled offenders for reintegration through supervised work and routine. Initially, Straffen appeared to adapt to this less restrictive environment, carrying out assigned duties and adhering to the hostel's rules. However, his compliance proved fragile. Within months, he relapsed into petty theft, exploiting moments of opportunity even within the controlled confines of the hostel. In February 1950, he was caught stealing a bag of walnuts, prompting a swift return to HM Prison Horfield. 6 months later, Straffen again ran afoul of authorities. He left the facility without authorization, and when staff and police attempted to return him, he resisted. This act of defiance underscored the challenges of managing his behavior and hinted at a growing pattern of impulsivity and disregard for rules, an early warning of the more serious crimes he would commit later. In early 1951, Straffen underwent further examination at a Bristol hospital. An electroencephalograph, e.g., revealed wide and severe damage to the cerebral cortex, damage that may have originated from the encephalitis he had suffered at the age of 6. Despite this neurological impairment, medical authorities deemed him sufficiently rehabilitated to be granted short periods of unsupervised home leave. During these intervals away from institutional supervision, Straffen secured work at Market Garden as an odd-job man. He applied the practical skills he had developed during his time at the Winchester Agricultural Hostel, performing tasks such as planting, harvesting, and basic maintenance. While his employment appeared productive, it also afforded him autonomy, unsupervised mobility, and opportunities that would later facilitate his more serious criminal activities. News that Straffen had independently obtained employment greatly impressed the officials at Hortham, and they allowed him to continue his work in horticulture. His progress was seen as a sign that he could function productively outside a strictly controlled institutional environment. Shortly thereafter, staff authorized his return to the care of his family, who by 1951 were living in Fountain Buildings, Bath. Under the provisions of the Mental Deficiency Act, Straffen underwent a further psychological assessment shortly after his 21st birthday. Hortham medical staff recommended that he remain classified as mentally deficient for a further 5 years. Straffen's family, however, disputed this outcome and lodged an appeal. On July 10, 1951, the medical officer of Health for Bath conducted a re-examination and reported an improvement in Straffen's mental age, now assessed at 10 years. Based on this assessment, he recommended that Straffen's certificate of mental deficiency be renewed for only 6 months, with the intention of considering his discharge at the end of that period. Although Straffen is not considered a suspect in Butcher's murder, author Letitia Fairfield has suggested that the widespread public and police outrage over the case may have influenced him. Straffen, already known for his deep resentment of authority and his smoldering hatred of police, may have internalized the event, recognizing that the strangulation of young girls could generate maximum fear and frustration among law enforcement. Although Straffen was never considered a suspect in the murder of Christine Vivian Butcher, author Letitia Fairfield suggests that the intense public and police outrage over the case may have influenced him. His lifelong intense resentment and smoldering hatred of law enforcement could have led him to perceive that strangling young girls would provoke the maximum frustration and fury from the authorities that on the afternoon of 15 July 1951, Straffen went to the local cinema alone, following his usual Sunday routine. Along the way, he passed Camden Crescent in Bath, the home of 5-year-old Brenda Constance Goddard, who lived with her foster parents. Although Brenda was normally restricted to her garden when unsupervised, that day she had wandered across the road to a nearby meadow to pick buttercups and daisies. According to Straffen's later statement to police, he noticed Brenda in the meadow, and she looked up and smiled at him. He asked, "What are you doing?" To which she replied, "Picking flowers, holding out a bunch of white flowers," as she continued to smile. After learning her name, Straffen said, "I know a place where there are even more flowers. They're in that wood. Shall I show you?" Brenda readily agreed that to the entrance to a nearby copse. Brenda allowed Straffen to lift her over a fence. Almost immediately, Straffen manually strangled her. Confused and frustrated that Brenda did not scream before losing consciousness, he then repeatedly struck her head against a large stone. Straffen made no attempt to conceal the body and simply continued to the cinema to watch the film Shockproof, after which he returned home that Brenda's foster mother reported her missing in the afternoon. Her body was discovered later that evening by a police officer, just a short distance from her home. No effort had been made to conceal the body, and numerous clipped white convolvulus flowers were found at the scene. The child had not been sexually assaulted, and investigators were unable to determine the actual motive for the crime. After ruling out Brenda's biological and foster family, police began interviewing local residents with criminal records. Straffen was questioned by Bath City Police in early August. He admitted wearing a navy blue suit on the day of the murder and acknowledged that he could have been the man seen walking past Brenda's home shortly before she went missing. But he denied any involvement in her death. With no physical evidence connecting him to the crime, authorities were unable to charge him. Prior to Straffin's formal police interview about Brenda's murder, his employer was contacted to verify his whereabouts on the day of the crime. This led to his dismissal at the end of July. Straffin blamed the police for losing his job, though his employer later explained that he had already intended to let Straffin go due to his declining work performance and his peculiar habit of hoarding flowers and vegetables in secret locations. In a later interview with a prison psychiatrist, Straffin admitted that, even though he had not been charged with Brenda's murder, he knew he was still under suspicion and resolved to continue antagonizing the police, a resolve that his dismissal only strengthened. That on August 8th, Straffin met 9-year-old Cicely Dorothy Batstone at the Forum Cinema in Bath while both were watching Tarzan and the Jungle Queen. He offered her a sweet, and they began talking. Cicely explained that her mother had allowed her to attend the cinema alone because it was Children's Day, though she admitted she was unsure what the term meant. Straffin replied that it probably meant children could do as they pleased for the whole day. After the film ended, Straffin offered to take Cicely to another local cinema to watch the Western. She wore a yellow ribbon, promising to pay her admission fee. Cicely agreed, and they traveled across town by bus. Shortly after getting off, they were seen walking along Bloomfield Road toward a nearby meadow at around 8 p.m. by Violet Cowley, the wife of a policeman who later said that seeing the two together had made her feel uneasy. Shortly after entering a meadow known locally as the Tumps, Cicely was manually strangled to death. Straffin then walked home, stopping to buy fish and chips along the way. Cicely's parents had been visiting friends that afternoon, believing their elder daughter Gladys would be home in time to look after her when Cicely returned from the cinema. When Cicely did not come back, Gladys at first assumed she was still with her parents. Because of this misunderstanding, the child was not reported missing until shortly before 11 o'clock that night. Once the report was made, police immediately launched a large-scale search. Earlier that same evening, Violet Cowley had mentioned to her husband, who was a police officer, that she had seen a young dark-haired girl wearing a gray cardigan and a colored dress walking toward the meadow known as the Tumps with a slim, blonde young man. The sight had made her feel uneasy, especially in light of the recent unsolved murder of another child in the area. When news of Cicely's disappearance spread early the following morning and the search began, Cowley informed the police of what she had seen and directed them to the location. Later that morning, Cicely's body was found beneath a hedge in the meadow in addition to Violet Cowley. Several other eyewitnesses reported seeing Straffin in Cicely's company before her death. Among them was the driver of the bus Cicely had taken, who told investigators the following morning that the child had been traveling with a young, blonde-haired man. The bus conductor also recalled seeing the pair and recognized Straffin as a former colleague. Further confirmation came from a courting couple who were walking through the meadow, known as the Tumps. They later told police they had seen a laughing child walking alongside a man whose appearance closely matched Straffin. Together, these accounts placed him with Cicely in the hours leading up to her murder. On the morning after Cicely's murder, police went to Straffin's home to question him. When officers explained the reason for their visit, Straffin immediately responded, "Is it about the girl I was at the pictures with last night?" His remark immediately alarmed investigators. Straffin was then taken to the old police station, where he was formally questioned in connection with the child's death. Straffin readily admitted to investigators that he had been in Cicely's company on the afternoon of her murder. At first, however, he denied any responsibility for her death, claiming that when he last saw her, she had been asleep in the Tumps. Shortly afterwards, he altered his account and acknowledged that he knew the child was dead, bluntly stating, "She is dead, but you can't prove I did it because no one saw me." He then went further, voluntarily confessing to the earlier killing of Brenda Goddard, telling officers, "The other girl, I did her the same." When asked why he had murdered the children, Straffin replied that he had done so to give the police something to really do, rather than having them continue to pursue him over what he considered minor offenses. He was subsequently formally charged with the murder of Cicely Batstone. Straffin formally appeared at the Guildhall in Bath on 24th August 1951, where he was charged with the murders of both children. He pleaded not guilty and was remanded in custody until 30th August. On 31st August, following a 2-day hearing at Bath Magistrates Court, A formal date was set for Straffen to stand trial for the murder of Cicely Batstone. Straffen stood trial at Taunton Assize Court on 17 October 1951 before Mr. Justice Oliver. The hearing lasted only 8 minutes. The sole witness was Peter Parks, the medical superintendent at HM Prison Horfield. Parks testified that he had examined Straffen on numerous occasions between 1947 and 1951, and that Straffen's level of mental deficiency had remained essentially unchanged since 1947. He further stated that Straffen was incapable of properly understanding the nature of the legal proceedings or the circumstances surrounding his trial. After hearing this evidence, Justice Oliver addressed the jury, stating that in England, individuals who are insane are not put on trial, explaining that a person who cannot comprehend what is happening cannot be tried. The jury subsequently ruled that Straffen was insane and unfit to plead. He was ordered to be detained at His Majesty's pleasure and transferred to Broadmoor Hospital, then known as the Broadmoor Asylum for the Criminally Insane, in Crowthorne, Berkshire. Constructed in the 19th century, Broadmoor Hospital had originally been known as a criminal lunatic asylum. However, following reforms introduced by the Criminal Justice Act of 1948, responsibility for the institution was transferred to the Ministry of Health. Those committed there were no longer classified as inmates, but as patients, reflecting a shift toward a more humane approach to care and custody. By the time of Straffen's committal, this revised regime was fully in place, and all patients within the hospital were subject to improved living conditions and treatment standards. Shortly after his arrival at the sprawling, high-security institution, Straffen was assigned work as a cleaner. In the early afternoon of late April 1952, Straffen, wearing his own civilian clothes beneath his issued work uniform, managed to escape from Broadmoor Hospital. While assigned to clean a neglected outbuilding, large disinfectant drums had been stacked against the institution's perimeter wall as part of the work detail. Using these drums, Straffen climbed onto the slate roof of a lean-to shed positioned beside the wall. At the time, he was briefly left unsupervised after the single guard overseeing the detail moved away to monitor other patients. Taking advantage of the moment, Straffen climbed from the shed roof to the top of the wall and lowered himself down on the opposite side before anyone could intervene. The escape was discovered shortly afterward. Local police were alerted without delay, and an immediate manhunt was launched to locate and recapture him. After escaping from Broadmoor, Straffen discarded his work uniform and traveled on foot for several hours, covering a distance of roughly 7 miles. By early evening, he arrived in the village of Farley Hill. According to eyewitnesses, he wandered around the area aimlessly, loitering without any clear purpose and drawing quiet attention from local residents. In the early evening, a local resident happened to glance out of a cottage window and noticed Straffen sitting on a bench, watching a 5-year-old girl, Linda Bowyer, as she rode her new bicycle around the village. This was the last reliable sighting of the child alive. Soon afterwards, Linda was lured away to a nearby field, where she was manually strangled to death. After killing the child, Straffen calmly walked to a nearby house and asked the occupant, Mrs. Loyalty Kenyon, for a glass of water and directions to Wokingham. He then left the village and later succeeded in hitching a lift from a female motorist, asking her to drop him near the Bramshill Hunt bus stop. As the motorist neared the bus stop, Straffen noticed a group of men standing nearby and nervously asked, "Is that the police? What are they doing?" He quickly got out of the vehicle and walked briskly toward a nearby pub while the motorist spoke to the men, who turned out to be Broadmoor staff and police officers. Minutes later, Straffen was seen talking to several young children in a lane about 150 yards behind the pub. He was finally apprehended at 6:40 p.m. in a nearby field after a brief chase and struggle that Linda's mother first realized her daughter was missing at 7:30 p.m. when Linda failed to return home and did not respond to her calls from the garden gate. Police, aided by soldiers stationed at Arborfield Military Camp, launched an immediate manhunt. The following morning at 5:25 a.m., Sergeant Percy Axford discovered Linda's fully clothed, strangled body beneath an oak tree in a Bluebell Copse. An autopsy revealed that she had been dead for 12 to 15 hours and had not been sexually assaulted. Investigators immediately traveled to Broadmoor to question Straffen about whether he had committed any additional crimes during his escape. When awoken and politely asked by Chief Inspector Frederick Francis if he had caused any mischief the previous day, Straffen initially replied, "I did not kill her," before adding, "I know you coppers. I know I killed Goddard and Batstone, but I did not kill the little girl on the bicycle." News of Straffen's escape and the fact that he had committed a third child murder prior to his recapture sparked intense public outrage. The security at Broadmoor came under particular scrutiny. According to contemporary press reports, Straffen later claimed to court officials that his escape had been intended to prove he could be out without killing little children. That on May 1st, 1952, investigators obtained a warrant to formally charge Straffen with the murder of Linda Boyer. He appeared the following day at Reading Magistrates Court to be officially notified of the charge and was subsequently detained in the hospital wing of HM Prison Brixton to await trial. Within months of Straffen's recapture, security at Broadmoor was tightened to levels comparable to a Category A prison. His escape and subsequent murder also prompted the introduction of a system of warning sirens around the hospital, designed to alert staff and the public in the event of an inmate escape. These sirens were tested weekly. Straffen was brought to trial at Winchester Assizes for the murder of Linda Boyer on July 21st, 1952, before Mr. Justice Castles. The prosecution was led by Solicitor General Sir Reginald Manningham Buller, while Straffen was defended by Henry Elam. Following his counsel's advice, Straffen pleaded not guilty. On the opening day, his defense lawyer told the jury that Straffen would not testify, citing his mental deficiency and stating, "A person found unfit to plead cannot make a proper defense and cannot follow the details of the evidence." The defense also left the question of his sanity to be determined by the jury, at the request of the prosecution. Mr. Justice Castles ruled during the opening stages of the trial that evidence of Straffen's 2 prior murders would be admissible as similar fact evidence. The prosecution highlighted patterns common to all 3 cases: the lack of any obvious motive, the young ages of the victims, the absence of any signs of struggle at the crime scenes, and the fact that none of the children's bodies had been concealed. Witnesses were called to testify to these circumstances, reinforcing the prosecution's case. The prosecution argued that Straffen had murdered Linda during the 4 hours he was at large before his recapture. Manningham Buller explained to the jury that police had accounted for Straffen's movements throughout most of this period using eyewitness testimony and the known timings of his actions, except for a critical 20-minute window. This gap began when Linda was last seen riding her bicycle in Farley Hill and ended when Straffen knocked on Mrs. Kenyon's door requesting a glass of water. Manningham Buller further demonstrated that a reconstruction of Straffen's path, from where he had been observed watching Linda to the cops, where her body was found, showed the walk would have taken approximately 6 minutes and 30 seconds, fitting within the unaccounted for interval. On July 23rd, Dr. Robert Donald Tier, the pathologist who had performed Linda Boyer's autopsy, testified that the pressure applied to her neck had been determined and applied at exactly the right points, as if by a person experienced in this method of killing. He further explained that, after comparing post-mortem photographs and reports of the 2 Bath children Straffen had previously confessed to murdering, he observed many similarities in the method of strangulation used on Brenda, Cicely, and Linda that Straffen's defense called witnesses who had previously evaluated him to provide evidence about his mental condition. They also called a woman and her son who claimed to have heard a young girl scream from the direction of the cops, where Linda's body was found at approximately 6:45 p.m., suggesting that Linda may have been killed after Straffen had already been recaptured. In response to the defense's arguments regarding Straffen's limited intellect and his purported inability to distinguish right from wrong, Solicitor General Manningham Buller called several Broadmoor medical officers and psychiatrists to testify. They explained that the treatment Straffen had received at the facility prior to his escape had improved his knowledge and IQ to the point where he could differentiate right from wrong and understand the basic principles of legal accountability for his actions. Among these experts, Dr. Thomas Monroe, a specialist in the treatment of mental deficiency, testified that Straffen had explicitly informed him that committing murder was wrong, both because it violated the law and because it contravened one of the commandments. Straffin's second murder trial lasted 4 days. After both prosecution and defense presented their closing arguments, Mr. Justice Castles gave his final instructions to the jury. He emphasized that if they were satisfied Straffin had killed Linda Bowyer, they needed to consider the insanity defense carefully. He explained that to succeed, the defense must clearly prove that, at the time of the act, Straffin was suffering from such a defect of reason that he either did not understand the nature and quality of his actions or did not know that what he was doing was legally wrong. Castles further noted that although Straffin had been certified as mentally defective, none of the medical witnesses on either side had claimed that he was insane within the meaning of medicine. The jury deliberated for only 29 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Following this, Mr. Justice Castles sentenced Straffin to death, telling him that his crime was a cruel and brutal act you committed knowingly on that girl. Straffin showed no visible emotion upon hearing the sentence. His mother, distraught, had to be escorted from the courtroom by her eldest son, Roy. As she cried, "He didn't do it." Present in the courtroom to hear the sentence were the mothers of all 3 of Straffin's victims. Straffin appealed his conviction, arguing that the trial judge had unfairly allowed evidence of his 2 previous murders to be admitted as similar fact evidence, and that his statements to investigators the morning after Linda's murder were improperly admitted because they had been made before he was formally cautioned. Both grounds of the appeal were dismissed on August 26th, and he was denied permission to appeal to the House of Lords. His execution was originally scheduled for September 4th, but the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment by Home Secretary David Maxwell Fyfe on August 29th, following his personal recommendation to the Queen for Straffin's reprieve. Straffin appealed his conviction, arguing that the trial judge had unfairly allowed evidence of his 2 previous murders to be admitted as similar fact evidence, and that his statements to investigators the morning after Linda's murder were improperly admitted, because they had been made before he was formally cautioned. Both grounds of the appeal were dismissed on August 26th, and he was denied permission to appeal to the House of Lords. His execution was originally scheduled for September 4th, but the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment by Home Secretary David Maxwell Fyfe on August 29th, following his personal recommendation to the Queen for Straffin's reprieve. In August 1958, Straffin was transferred to HM Prison Cardiff when the security level at HM Prison Horfield was reduced. This stay was brief, and by June 1960, he had returned to a maximum security block at Horfield. After the completion of a 28-cell high-security wing at HM Prison Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight, Straffin was secretly moved there on January 31st, 1966. 2 years later, in May 1968, he was transferred to HM Prison Durham, where he was housed in a high-security section. At Durham, he was described as taciturn, aloof, and hostile, constantly circling and banging on the fence, speaking only when necessary, and remaining largely isolated. For the first 50 years of Straffin's imprisonment, the Home Secretary had the discretionary power to overrule any decisions regarding the release of life-sentence prisoners, whether recommended for parole or having served the minimum term set at trial. Successive Home Secretaries consistently refused to consider Straffin for release. In 1994, then Home Secretary Michael Howard compiled a list of 20 prisoners serving life sentences who were deemed never to be released, and Straffin's name was included. This list was later published by the News of the World in December 1997. In 2001, Straffin's solicitors formally requested a reopening of his case, arguing that he had never been fit to stand trial as a sane individual. This request came shortly after investigative journalist Robert Woffenden, having examined previously undisclosed records, revealed that Straffin's death sentence had been reprieved by David Maxwell Fyfe because the majority of doctors who assessed him before his second trial had declared him insane. Woffenden also raised doubts about Straffin's guilt in the murder of Linda Bowyer, noting that at the time of his arrest, Straffin had bitten his fingernails down to the quick, whereas distinctive fingernail marks had been found on the child's neck, and 2 local witnesses suggested the approximate time of her murder occurred after Straffin had been recaptured. Straffin's application to the Criminal Cases Review Commission to have his conviction reviewed was ultimately rejected in December 2002. In May 2002, the European Court of Human Rights, ECDHR, began considering cases brought by prisoners serving life sentences who challenged the authority of the Home Secretary to refuse release after parole board recommendations. The court ultimately ruled that politicians should not determine minimum terms for life sentence prisoners, declaring the practice of Home Secretaries overruling parole board decisions unlawful. At the time of this ruling, Straffin was incarcerated at HM Prison Longlarton. John Straffin died of natural causes in the healthcare center of HM Prison Franklin following a brief illness on the morning of November 19, 2007. At the time of his death, he was 77 years old and had been incarcerated for 55 years, 3 months, and 26 days, making him the longest-serving prisoner in British criminal history. Although Straffin always denied responsibility for the murder of Linda Bowyer, he openly admitted to killing Brenda Goddard and Cicely Batstone 3 days after his death. Investigative journalist Robert Woffenden wrote in The Guardian that Straffin would be remembered by many in the United Kingdom as one of the country's most notorious child murderers. Case 3, let me explain. Susan Atkins was born in the sunlit town of San Gabriel, California, in the late 1940s, into a family that seemed ordinary at first glance, but was soon revealed to be fraught with instability and sorrow. Her lineage was a patchwork of English, Irish, Scottish, and German heritage. Yet these distant connections could not shield her from the chaos of her upbringing. Her parents, Jean and Edward Atkins, struggled with alcoholism, and their volatile home life left deep scars on their children. Susan was the middle child of 3, navigating a childhood that teetered between fleeting moments of normalcy and the heavy shadow of loss. When her mother succumbed to cancer in the mid-1960s, Susan's world collapsed further, leaving her to confront grief and abandonment at a tender age. The following years were marked by upheaval, frequent moves, fractured family connections, and the hard necessity of independence as she sought to create a life apart from the disintegration surrounding her. In her early years, Susan had been a quiet, introverted girl who found solace in music and the routines of school life. She sang in the Glee Club and participated in her church choir, offering glimpses of a gentle, creative side that contrasted sharply with the turbulence at home. 2 weeks before her mother's final hospitalization, she orchestrated a small act of tenderness, arranging for choir members to sing carols beneath her mother's bedroom window, a fleeting attempt to cling to normalcy amid sorrow. But death and disruption could not be delayed, and once her mother passed, the burden of survival fell squarely on Susan and her siblings. Relatives were called upon to assist, but stability was fleeting, and Susan's adolescent years became a patchwork of temporary homes, disconnected guardianship, and a growing sense of vulnerability. Eventually, Susan and her younger brother were left in the care of their father when he moved to Los Baños for work, leaving the children to fend for themselves much of the time. The father's job at a construction site kept him away, forcing Susan to seek employment while still attending high school, taking on adult responsibilities that should never have fallen upon her. Her performance in school began to suffer, particularly after transferring to a new high school in Los Baños, where the environment was unfamiliar and unsupportive. It was a period defined by instability, survival, and gradual detachment from the innocence of her early years. Amid this instability, Susan's search for belonging and identity became more urgent, guiding her toward experiences that would ultimately set the stage for her descent into darkness. By the mid-1960s, she had begun to explore new forms of independence, traveling with classmates, working in Los Angeles as a performer, and even participating in avant-garde shows for audiences she scarcely knew. These experiences, while seemingly daring and liberating, also introduced her to a world of moral ambiguity, danger, and the allure of charismatic figures who offered belonging and significance. It was during this volatile period that she encountered Charles Manson, a man whose charisma masked a deeply manipulative and violent nature. Drawn to him, Susan joined his commune, leaving behind any remaining semblance of conventional life. Within the Manson family, she was renamed Sadie Mae Glutz, a name that symbolized the complete submersion of her personal identity into a collective that glorified obedience, chaos, and fear. The family's existence was a strange combination of freedom and terror. Freedom from societal constraints, but terror in the unspoken rules of Manson's dominance. Life at the Spawn Ranch, a remote and dusty location in Southern California, offered isolation and secrecy, where the group could operate free from outside interference. It was here that Susan gave birth to a son, a child named by Manson with a name that felt more like a symbol than a life. Her maternal bond, however, was severed by her criminal actions, and her child was adopted, removed from her influence as the consequences of her life choices began to crystallize. The darkness of the family escalated into acts of violence, first with acquaintances and then spiraling into notorious murder. One of their earliest and most chilling acts involved Gary Hinman, a man who was believed to have come into a fortune. Under Manson's direction, Susan and other family members attempted to pressure Hinman for money. When he resisted, he was brutally beaten, and Manson himself inflicted injuries with a sword. Over the following days, Hinman's defiance ended in murder, his blood marking walls alongside messages meant to mislead investigators. A cruel prelude to the more infamous crimes that would follow. As summer turned toward its apex, the family's violence escalated to a calculated and horrifying peak. Manson orchestrated attacks on Sharon Tate and the LaBiancas, sending Susan and other members to invade their homes under the pretense of theft and obedience. These nights were filled with terror, bloodshed, and acts so brutal that they seemed almost ritualistic in their cruelty. Susan herself left her mark, writing words in blood that symbolized both chaos and the deranged ideology that Manson had instilled. Each act was a mixture of fear, manipulation, and an attempt to shock the world, a performance that blurred the lines between devotion, madness, and murder. The aftermath of these murders brought law enforcement into the orbit of the family, their secluded existence no longer shielded by the desolation of the ranch. Susan's confessions, shared in whispered conversations with fellow inmates, revealed the full scope of her involvement. Authorities pieced together these confessions with forensic evidence and witness testimony, unraveling the narrative of violence that Manson and his followers had orchestrated. Susan's grand jury testimony, delivered in chilling detail, exposed the mechanisms of terror and the obedience demanded by Manson, painting a portrait of complicity and psychological manipulation that shocked even seasoned prosecutors. Throughout the trial, Susan's demeanor oscillated between defiance, indifference, and confession. She testified about her own participation, sometimes in lurid detail, at other times retracting statements under the complex interplay of fear, manipulation, and survival. Her co-defendants mirrored her contradictions, and the courtroom became a theater of horror, revealing the depths of human obedience and cruelty. Ultimately, the sentences were severe. Death, later commuted to life imprisonment following legal reforms, cementing the consequences of a life steeped in violence and chaos. Prison life brought its own twists of fate. Susan converted to religion, embraced the role of mentor and helper to other inmates, and even married twice while incarcerated. Her health later deteriorated drastically, leading to paralysis and terminal illness. Parole hearings became emotional battlegrounds, with victims' families opposing release while supporters argued for compassionate consideration. Despite her declining health and the passage of decades, Susan remained behind bars, a living reminder of the terror that had once unfolded under Manson's influence. Ultimately, Susan Atkins died in prison, her life ending quietly, yet inevitably, her last whispered word carrying the weight of her journey from childhood innocence through the depths of violence and, finally, into mortality. Her story remains a haunting chronicle of manipulation, fear, and the fragility of human morality, a testament to the ease with which ordinary lives can be consumed by obsession, ideology, and cruelty. Case 4, very little is known about Baldy's early life, shrouded in shadows and whispers from his neighborhood in Queens. From a young age, he was drawn to the thrill of breaking and entering, slipping quietly into homes under the cover of night, leaving behind only fear and confusion. Those around him noticed unusual behavior, moments when his mind seemed elsewhere, as if caught between reality and something darker. Concerned, his family arranged for him to receive care at a state hospital where he spent several years under observation and treatment. During his time there, he discovered a strange fascination with carpentry, spending hours in the workshop, meticulously shaping wood, a calm and precise skill in stark contrast to the chaos of his past. Even in this controlled environment, there was an air of unease about him, a sense that something more dangerous and unpredictable lingered just beneath the surface. One evening in the early 1970s, Baldy was wandering the streets of Jamaica in search of a place to hide, his eyes scanning buildings with a cold, calculating intent. He eventually fixated on a modest apartment tucked away on a quiet avenue. Slipping into a narrow alley behind the building, he climbed through an open window, entering a home where life continued blissfully unaware of the danger approaching. Inside, a young woman was visiting with her family, tending to the comforts of her children and catching up with relatives. In an instant, the tranquility shattered. Baldy produced a knife, and a single, brutal act transformed the room into a scene of chaos and terror. The woman, stunned and bleeding, struggled to alert her loved ones before collapsing to the floor. By the time help arrived, it was too late to save her. Baldy vanished into the night as silently as he had come, leaving no trace behind. Despite relentless investigation, the authorities were left grasping at shadows, unable to uncover the identity of the man who had struck so suddenly and so violently. After the shocking murder, Baldy seemed to slip further into the shadows of the city, prowling through the ground floor apartments of Richmond Hill and Woodhaven as if drawn by some unrelenting compulsion. His nocturnal excursions continued with quiet precision, leaving neighbors uneasy and authorities puzzled. One early morning in the fall of 1971, a vigilant resident noticed a figure slipping through a window of a nearby home and quickly alerted the police. Officers were dispatched, weaving through the dimly lit streets, and soon caught sight of the man moving stealthily among the buildings. As they approached to question him, the air suddenly snapped with tension. Baldy drew a small revolver from his hip, aiming with deadly intent. Fate intervened when the weapon misfired, giving the officers the critical moments they needed to subdue him. A search of his belongings revealed a stolen driver's license, leading investigators to the terrified woman whose apartment had been violated. Baldy's trail of crimes, burglary, theft, attempted murder, and unlawful possession of a weapon, finally began to catch up with him, the law closing in on a man who had long haunted the quiet streets of the neighborhood. Because of his troubled mental state and the violent path he had taken, Baldy was sent to a psychiatric hospital in Beacon to undergo evaluation and treatment while the wheels of justice slowly turned. Within the sterile walls of the institution, he remained under observation for months, his presence a quiet reminder of the darkness that had spilled into the city streets. By the end of November, he was transferred back to his former facility, returning to the place where his troubled mind had first been examined. The following month, a grand jury formally charged him with the crimes he had committed, setting the stage for what many expected to be an inevitable trial. Yet a strange series of bureaucratic missteps intervened. The legal office was never informed of his return, and the institution itself remained unaware of the pending indictment. In an almost surreal twist, a man responsible for terror and bloodshed was released, free to walk the streets once more, the system's errors granting him a temporary reprieve from the consequences that awaited him. Barely 2 months had passed since his unexpected release when Baldy returned to the shadows, his actions growing increasingly reckless and violent. In the stillness of a March night, he slipped into an apartment in Jamaica, moving with the eerie precision of someone who had done this countless times before. Inside, a young teenager slept quietly, unaware of the danger that had crept into her home. In a sudden, terrifying moment, Baldy attacked, taking a life before anyone could intervene. The room, once a place of safety and warmth, became a scene of horror, and by the time her parents stirred, he had already vanished into the night, leaving behind only fear and unanswered questions. His crimes were no longer just theft. They had escalated into something far more sinister. The city's calm nights now haunted by the presence of a predator who seemed impossible to stop. As spring settled over the city, Baldy's violence escalated with a terrifying intensity. In April, he forced his way into the ground floor apartment of a young secretary, a woman recently engaged to a local policeman, slipping silently past her family who shared the home. Alone in her bedroom, she was caught completely off guard, and in a sudden, brutal attack, Baldy stabbed her multiple times. The aftermath left the apartment a scene of horror, the intrusion not only shattering a life, but violating the sanctity of her home in a deeply disturbing way. Only months later, he struck again, this time near his own rooming house. A teenage girl fell victim to his relentless attacks, managing to stumble into her parents' room in a desperate plea for help, her words barely registering before she collapsed, fatally wounded. Each act pushed the boundaries of his cruelty, leaving the neighborhood in fear and authorities scrambling. Yet Baldy continued to elude capture, a shadow moving through the city with lethal precision. In the days following the tragic death of a teenage girl, whispers began to circulate among her classmates, stories of a tall, thin man with dark hair who had been lurking near their homes, watching, waiting. These sightings echoed the reports of other women who had narrowly escaped his violence, creating a thread of fear that stretched through the neighborhood. On a sweltering June day, two detectives from the Queens Homicide Squad spotted a man fitting that chilling description as he walked casually down the street. He was Baldy. Calmly, he agreed to accompany them to the station, and once inside, the full weight of his crimes began to surface. In a quiet, almost detached voice, he admitted that he might have hurt the young girl, the casual phrasing doing nothing to mask the horror of the act. Further investigation revealed a trail of violence reaching even further, including an attempted attack on a police officer. Soon, authorities connected him to multiple murders he had alluded to in his own confessions, finally confronting a man who had long haunted the city's streets with terror and evaded justice for far too long. In the wake of his capture, the courts moved first to address the attack on Officer Hamburger, the case that had finally brought Baldy into the legal spotlight. Throughout the hearings, Baldy maintained a claim of insanity, pleading not guilty on the grounds that his mind was fractured beyond control. His attorney painted a picture of a man tormented by schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder, arguing that the law could not hold him fully responsible for actions committed under the sway of a disturbed psyche. The prosecution countered with expert testimony from a leading psychiatrist who insisted that Baldy had been fully aware of what he was doing when he raised his weapon against the officer, emphasizing the cold deliberation behind his violence. After 8 tense days in the courtroom, the jury reached a verdict. Baldy was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a decision that cleared the way for prosecutors to pursue the far graver charges of multiple murders, bringing the city one step closer to confronting the full scope of his crimes as the trial for the murders drew near. Unusual courtroom procedures highlighted the strangeness of Baldy's mind. His attorney and the prosecutors reached an agreement. Baldy's reenactments of his crimes, trance-like performances in which he mimicked opening doors and wiping imaginary blood from knives, would not be admitted as evidence. Yet the prosecution had their own proof, presenting a lengthy police recording in which Baldy coldly confessed to 4 brutal murders. The court, however, became mired in legal technicalities. Some charges were dismissed because his attorney had only represented him in the case involving the teenage girl, leaving unanswered questions about the other murders and frustrating the pursuit of full justice. When confronted with the confession tape, Baldy claimed he had no memory of making the admissions, a defense bolstered by testimony from his attorney and a psychiatrist who documented years of mental illness and institutional evaluations. Despite these efforts to paint him as legally insane, the court ultimately concluded that Baldy had understood his actions fully. He was convicted of the murder, receiving a sentence of 25 years to life, at Sing Sing prison. Appeals were filed over the years, but none succeeded. Baldy spent the remainder of his life behind bars, his name forever etched into the city's dark history, until he died quietly in his cell in 2009, the details of his death shrouded in obscurity, leaving behind a chilling legacy of violence and terror. The decision to release Baldy from the mental hospital, citing his behavior as a model inmate, sparked outrage and fear throughout New York City. Many could not reconcile the image of a man capable of such calculated violence with the calm, obedient demeanor he had displayed behind institutional walls. Comparisons were drawn to other notorious killers who had similarly been deemed rehabilitated, men who had fooled the system only to strike again once freed. The city watched with uneasy eyes, aware that the line between order and chaos could be razor thin, and that even those who seemed tame could conceal a darkness too dangerous to contain. Case 5, let me explain. On a quiet evening in early May 1993, 3 young boys vanished from their neighborhood in West Memphis, Arkansas, sending shockwaves through the tight-knit community. The first alert came from the adoptive father of one of the boys, who reported his child missing just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Neighbors recalled seeing the trio playing together earlier that day, carefree and laughing, while another adult, the stepfather of one of the boys, called for them to come home. But by nightfall, they were nowhere to be found. Initial searches that evening were hasty and limited, relying largely on friends and neighbors who scoured the area in a desperate attempt to locate the children. They even passed near the spot where the boys would eventually be discovered, unaware of the grim scene waiting there. By the following morning, the search had escalated dramatically. Crittenden County search and rescue teams mobilized, combing every corner of West Memphis with a particular focus on the wooded expanse known as Robin Hood Hills, where the children had last been seen. Volunteers formed human chains, sweeping the terrain with painstaking precision, yet the forest yielded nothing. The boys remained hidden, their absence casting a growing shadow of fear and uncertainty over the community, leaving parents, friends, and investigators alike grappling with the impossible question: what had become of them? The following afternoon, the search took a horrifying turn. Around mid-afternoon, a juvenile parole officer noticed a small black shoe floating in the murky waters of a creek that fed into a larger drainage channel in Robin Hood Hills. What initially seemed like a simple clue quickly escalated into a scene of unimaginable terror. A thorough search of the muddy ditch revealed the bodies of all 3 boys. They had been stripped and bound in a cruel, meticulous manner, their own shoelaces twisted tightly to secure their wrists to their ankles, arms and legs restrained in mirror-like precision. Their clothing had been discarded into the water, some of it caught on sticks thrust into the mud, twisted and inside out, with certain garments, including 2 pairs of underwear, never recovered. The youngest, Christopher Byers, bore devastating injuries with deep lacerations and horrifying mutilation. Forensic examinations painted a grim picture of their deaths. Byers had suffered multiple injuries, while the other 2 boys had died from a combination of trauma and drowning. Early investigations raised the possibility of sexual assault, though subsequent analysis and testimony would dispute some of these conclusions. Trace amounts of biological material were found on 1 pair of pants recovered, fueling the controversy and uncertainty surrounding the case. Experts disagreed sharply. Some argued that Byers' injuries were inflicted deliberately with a knife. Others contended that certain wounds could have been caused by animal activity after death. Questions lingered over whether the boys had been attacked at the creek itself or brought there after the assault. What was certain, however, was that Robin Hood Hills had become the site of a nightmare that would haunt the community for years, a place where innocence had been shattered with brutal and incomprehensible cruelty. Among the grim discoveries, one detail set Christopher Byers apart from the others: traces of a prescription drug in his system. Byers had been receiving medication to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, a routine part of his life that offered some measure of stability amid childhood struggles. Yet the toxicology report revealed only a faint, subtherapeutic level of the drug, raising questions about whether he had even taken it on the day he vanished. Even this small, clinical detail became part of the larger, unsettling picture. A child navigating ordinary challenges, caught in an extraordinary horror that no medicine could have prepared him for, his routine existence abruptly consumed by forces beyond comprehension. Steve Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore were inseparable friends, all second graders at Weaver Elementary, bound not only by school, but by shared adventures in their local Cub Scout pack, where each had proudly earned the rank of Wolf. Among them, Steve stood out as a bright and diligent child. The son of a divorced couple, he lived with his mother, her new husband, and a young half-sister, navigating the complexities of blended family life with remarkable poise for his age. Just 8 years old, small and energetic, with blonde hair that caught the sun as he rode his black and red bicycle through the neighborhood, Steve was a model student and an eager participant in the everyday joys of childhood. His presence brought warmth and laughter to those around him, a stark contrast to the darkness that would soon engulf his world. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Steve was laid to rest in Mount Zion Cemetery in Steele, Missouri, leaving behind memories of innocence cruelly cut short. Christopher Byers was a quiet, gentle boy whose life had been shaped by both love and change. Born to Melissa DeFeer and Ricky Murray, he experienced the upheaval of his parents' divorce at just 4 years old, before being adopted by his mother's new husband, John Mark Byers. At 8 years old, small and fragile, with light brown hair and an unassuming presence, Christopher navigated his days with the innocence of a child who still believed in magic, delighting in the wonder of Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. On the day he vanished, he was dressed simply in blue jeans, dark shoes, and a white long-sleeved shirt, blending into the familiar streets he had always known. He lived in a bustling household with his mother, adoptive father, and teenage stepbrother, yet carried the gentle curiosity and quiet joy of childhood in everything he did. After the tragedy that cut his life short, Christopher was laid to rest in Forest Hill Cemetery East in Memphis, Tennessee, remembered for the innocence and warmth he brought to those around him. Michael Moore was a spirited and confident boy, known among his friends as the natural leader of the trio. The son of Todd and Dana Moore, he lived in a busy household with his parents and his 9-year-old sister, Dawn, carrying himself with a mix of energy and quiet determination. At 8 years old, standing just over 4 feet tall, with brown hair and a lively curiosity, Michael took pride in his identity as a Cub Scout, often wearing his uniform even when not at meetings, a symbol of his leadership and sense of responsibility. On the day he disappeared, he pedaled a light green bicycle through his neighborhood, dressed in his blue Boy Scouts shirt and matching hat, the bright colors a stark contrast to the shadows that would soon fall over his life. Michael's death left a hole in the hearts of those who knew him, and he was laid to rest in Crittenden Memorial Park Cemetery in Marion, Arkansas, remembered as a boy full of energy, leadership, and promise cruelly taken too soon in the years that followed. The community sought a way to honor the lives of the 3 boys whose innocence had been so violently stolen. In 1994, a memorial was established on the playground of Weaver Elementary School, the very school where Steve, Christopher, and Michael had been second graders, their laughter once echoing across the same grounds where children now played in remembrance. The memorial served as both a tribute and a solemn reminder of the tragedy that had forever changed West Memphis. 2 decades later, on the 20th anniversary of the murders, the school's principal, driven by a desire to preserve their memory, organized efforts to restore and refurbish the site, ensuring that the boys' names and stories would continue to be remembered, and that the playground, a symbol of childhood lost too soon, would stand as a place of reflection and enduring remembrance to the time of their arrests. The 3 young men were still teenagers, each carrying the weight of their own troubled paths. Jesse Miskelly Jr. was 17, known locally for his quick temper and frequent schoolyard fights. Jason Baldwin, 16, was the opposite in temperament, disciplined and artistic, excelling in his studies and showing a talent for drawing that had earned him encouragement from a teacher to pursue graphic design in the future. Damian Eccles, 18, came from a struggling family, often visited by social workers, with school attendance sporadic and his days shadowed by hardship. Baldwin and Eccles have been drawn together by shared interests, bonding over music, books, and a growing disillusionment with the rigid cultural climate of their West Memphis community, set deep in the Bible Belt. They knew Miss Gelly from school, though their connection was distant, a casual acquaintance rather than a true friendship. Eccles' life was marked by turbulence. He and a girlfriend once ran away, and in a desperate attempt to seek shelter from a storm, broke into a trailer, leading to his arrest for burglary. The three young men, each with their own struggles and small brushes with the law, would soon find themselves swept into a case far larger and far darker than anything they had ever known. Before the trial began, Damian Eccles' troubled past and fragile mental state became central to his defense. He had spent several months confined to a mental institution in Arkansas, a period that highlighted the challenges he faced in navigating daily life. Following his release, he was granted full disability status by the Social Security Administration, a formal recognition of the struggles that had long shadowed him. During the trial, his defense called upon expert testimony to paint a fuller picture of his condition. Dr. George W. Woods testified that Eccles suffered from a constellation of psychological difficulties, providing context for a young man whose life had been shaped by instability, hardship, and the ongoing scrutiny of a community ready to judge him harshly. The testimony sought to reveal the vulnerability behind the teenager who would soon find himself at the center of one of the most controversial criminal cases in West Memphis history. Damian Eccles' mental state became a central focus during the trial, with experts describing him as suffering from serious psychiatric disorder marked by grandiose and persecutory delusions, hallucinations both auditory and visual, chaotic thought patterns, a profound lack of insight, and severe, incapacitating mood swings. Months before the tragic murders, his psychologist testified that Eccles had even claimed to possess supernatural powers, allegedly obtained through drinking human blood. At the time of his arrest, however, Eccles was attempting to live a semblance of a normal life, working part-time for a roofing company and expecting a child with his girlfriend, Dominique Tier, though the shadow of his troubled past and unusual beliefs loomed over him. Early in the investigation, the West Memphis police briefly considered two other local teenagers as potential suspects, Chris Morgan and Brian Holland. Both had prior drug-related offenses and had left town abruptly for Oceanside, California, just days after the boys' bodies were discovered. Morgan, who had driven an ice cream truck through the neighborhood, was thought to be at least tangentially familiar with the victims. When the pair were arrested in California, polygraph exams suggested deception when they denied involvement in the murders. Under questioning, Morgan admitted a history of substance abuse and blackouts, even momentarily suggesting he might have been involved in the killings, only to quickly withdraw the statement. These early leads added another layer of tension and confusion to an already baffling case, illustrating how fear and suspicion gripped the community in the aftermath of the tragedy. California authorities sent blood and urine samples from Chris Morgan and Brian Holland to West Memphis, but there is no record that the local police pursued a full investigation of either teenager after their brief arrest. The fleeting statements and confessions made during questioning would later become a point of contention at trial, though ultimately, any claims by Morgan suggesting possible involvement were barred from evidence, leaving the case to focus elsewhere. Meanwhile, another potential lead emerged in the form of a mysterious figure known only as Mr. Bojangles. On the evening of May 5, 1993, shortly after the boys disappeared, workers at a nearby restaurant reported seeing a black man behaving erratically inside the ladies' restroom. They described him as disoriented and bleeding, brushing against the walls in a way that suggested confusion or distress. Officer Regina Meeks responded to the call, taking a statement from the restaurant manager through the drive-thru window, but by the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. The restroom itself was never fully examined that night, leaving his identity and any connection to the tragedy shrouded in uncertainty. This brief sighting added yet another layer of mystery to a case already filled with conflicting leads, unanswered questions, and a community desperate for closure. The day after the boys' bodies were discovered, the mysterious figure known as Mr. Bojangles returned to the spotlight. Marty King, the restaurant manager who had first reported the disoriented, bleeding man, followed up with police, prompting officers to finally inspect the ladies' restroom in detail. Witnesses described the man as wearing a blue cast with white Velcro straps, a detail that cast doubt on any direct connection to the brutal murders, as such a brace would have made it nearly impossible to restrain and kill 3 children. King also handed over a pair of sunglasses he believed had been left behind. Investigators collected blood samples from the walls and tiles, but the trail soon went cold when the material was lost, leaving only a single hair, later identified as belonging to a black male. Recovered from a sheet wrapped around one of the victims, as investigators searched for answers, suspicion began to fall on Damien Eccles, whose fascination with the occult and dark imagery seemed to fit a narrative the police were constructing. Officers James Sudbury and Steve Jones openly speculated that the murders might have cult overtones, and Eccles' interests made him a person of interest. He was interviewed 2 days after the discovery of the bodies and subjected to a polygraph test, which reportedly indicated deception when he denied involvement. A subsequent formal interview further fueled suspicion when Eccles mentioned the genital wounds inflicted on one of the victims, a detail that investigators saw as potentially incriminating. Yet, despite the swirling suspicions, no physical evidence ever directly connected Eccles, Jason Baldwin, or Jesse Miskelly Jr. to the crime, leaving the investigation mired in uncertainty, theory, and fear as the community grappled with a horror that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. As weeks passed with little progress in the investigation, police increasingly focused their attention on Damien Eccles, questioning him more frequently than anyone else. Officially, authorities maintained that he was not considered a direct suspect, but rather a source of information. Yet the intensity of the interrogation suggested otherwise. That on June 3rd, the spotlight turned to Jesse Miskelly Jr., a 17-year-old with a reported IQ of 72, placing him in the borderline intellectual functioning range. Despite his age and mental capacity, he was questioned alone, without his parents present. His father had allowed him to go with the police, but had not explicitly consented to an interrogation. Miskelly was subjected to roughly 12 grueling hours of questioning, though only 2 short segments, totaling 46 minutes, were officially recorded. Under extreme fatigue and intimidation, he eventually confessed, though he quickly recanted, claiming he had been coerced, threatened, and frightened, admitting later that he had been scared of the police throughout the process. Though he had been read his Miranda rights, Miskelly later testified that he did not fully comprehend their meaning. The confession, however, was later ruled voluntary by the Arkansas Supreme Court in 1996, which determined that he understood the warning and its consequences. Portions of his statements were leaked to the press, appearing on the front page of the Memphis Commercial Appeal before the trials even began, amplifying public attention and the pressure surrounding the already tense and tragic case. In the months following Jesse Miskelly Jr.'s initial confession, the investigation intensified. Police soon arrested Damien Eccles and his close friend Jason Baldwin, cementing the focus of the case on the 3 young men. Nearly 8 months after his first statement, on February 17, 1994, Miskelly made another, more detailed confession to the authorities. His attorney, Dan Stidham, was present the entire time, repeatedly warning Miskelly not to speak, but the teen ignored this advice and went on to describe in chilling detail how the boys had been abused and murdered. Years later, Stidham would publicly critique the investigation, highlighting what he considered major errors and misconceptions on the part of law enforcement, and he reiterated these concerns during interviews, including a radio appearance in 2010 at the trial of Eccles and Baldwin. Physical evidence was sparse and highly contested. The prosecution presented 2 green threads recovered from the crime scene, claiming they were microscopically similar to a green child's t-shirt from Eccles' sister's closet, as well as a single red rayon fiber said to match a woman's robe in Baldwin's home. Yet under scrutiny, even the state's witness admitted that fibers from many sources can appear nearly identical under a microscope, acknowledging that these small traces could not definitively link the suspects to the crime. The tenuous nature of the evidence only deepened the uncertainty surrounding the case, highlighting the reliance on confessions and circumstantial connections rather than clear, irrefutable proof. Vicki Hutchison, a recent arrival to West Memphis, would become an unexpected and controversial figure in the investigation. Her testimony later recanted amid claims of coercion by police. On May 6, 1993, before the boys' bodies were even discovered, Hutchison arrived at the Marion Police Department to undergo a polygraph exam regarding a minor theft from her employer. Her young son, Aaron, accompanied her, proving an unexpected distraction that prevented the test from being properly conducted. Yet it was Aaron's own words that would draw the attention of law enforcement. The boy, a playmate of the murdered children, mentioned to Detective Don Bray that the boys had been killed at the playhouse. When the grim discovery later aligned roughly with the location Aaron had indicated, investigators pressed him for more details. In a series of statements that were increasingly fantastical and inconsistent, Aaron claimed he had witnessed the murders committed by Satanists who spoke Spanish. Despite repeated questioning, he could not identify Jason Baldwin, Damian Eccles, or Jesse Miskelly from photo lineups, and there was no playhouse at the location he described. Nonetheless, portions of his statements were leaked to the press, fueling sensationalized media coverage and contributing to a growing, widespread belief that the murders were part of a dark, ritualistic satanic act, a notion that would haunt the West Memphis case and the community's collective psyche for years to come. Around the beginning of June 1993, Vicki Hutchison became entangled even more deeply in the investigation. At the suggestion of police, she agreed to a plan in which hidden microphones were placed in her home to record a conversation with Damian Eccles. Jesse Miskelly Jr. facilitated the meeting, introducing Hutchison to Eccles. According to her account, the conversation yielded nothing incriminating, though authorities later described the recording as inaudible, while Hutchison insisted it had captured speech clearly. The next day, Hutchison told police a far more sensational story. Roughly 2 weeks after the murders, she claimed she had attended a Wiccan meeting in Toral, Arkansas, with Eccles and Miskelly. At the gathering, she alleged, a drunken Eccles openly boasted about killing the 3 boys. Details were sparse. However, Hutchison could not recall the location of the meeting, nor could she name any other participants. The very next day, Miskelly was questioned in connection with these claims. Hutchison herself would later admit that her statements were motivated by fear of facing criminal charges and by the potential for a reward if she helped identify the alleged murderers. She never faced prosecution for theft, yet her testimony, inconsistent and sensational, played a pivotal role in shaping the investigation. Her accounts, true or not, lent the case an air of ritualistic conspiracy, feeding the public's perception that the tragedy might have been tied to dark, occult practices, a perception that would shadow the trial and the lives of Eccles, Baldwin, and Miskelly for decades to come. In 1994, the legal proceedings began, marking the start of a highly charged and closely watched series of trials. Jesse Miskelly Jr. was tried separately from Damian Eccles and Jason Baldwin due to the Bruton Rule, which prevented his confession from being used against his co-defendants. All 3 pleaded not guilty, setting the stage for a courtroom battle over evidence, coercion, and the murky lines between truth and suggestion. During Miskelly's trial, experts were called to examine the circumstances of his confession. Richard Offsch, a renowned authority on false confessions and police coercion, and a professor of sociology at UC Berkeley, testified that the brief recorded interrogation of Miskelly was a classic example of how law enforcement pressure could elicit statement from a vulnerable teen. Critics noted that Miskelly's multiple confessions were inconsistent with each other and often conflicted with the physical evidence from the crime scene, including implausible claims that he had witnessed acts that were later determined to be impossible. Authorities had initially suspected sexual assault based on post-mortem examinations, but forensic analysis would later confirm that there was no evidence of rape. The apparent dilation observed was, in fact, a normal post-mortem condition. On February 5, 1994, the jury returned its verdict. Miss Kelly was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. The court imposed a sentence of life plus 40 years, reflecting both the severity of the crimes and the contentious nature of the evidence. Appeals followed, but the Arkansas Supreme Court ultimately affirmed the conviction, cementing Miss Kelly's fate and leaving lingering questions about the role of coercion, youth, and missteps in a case that had captivated and horrified the public. Just 3 weeks after Miss Kelly's conviction, Damian Echols and Jason Baldwin faced their own trial, one that gripped West Memphis with a mixture of fear, speculation, and sensationalism. The prosecution painted the case as the chilling culmination of a satanic ritual, calling upon Dale W. Griffiths, a self-described expert in the occult, to testify that the murders bore the hallmarks of ritualistic killing. The courtroom was charged with tension as the jury listened to testimony that straddled the line between fact and fear, and on March 19, 1994, the verdicts were delivered. Echols was found guilty on 3 counts of murder and sentenced to death, while Baldwin received a life sentence. Throughout the proceedings, the defense worked to dismantle the prosecution's claims, arguing that much of Echols' purported knowledge about the crimes could have been gleaned from media reports. Echols himself testified that his understanding of the case was largely limited to what he had seen on television. The prosecution countered, insisting that his details were too precise, particularly regarding the drowning of the victims and the disproportionate mutilation of one boy, facts that had not been publicly reported at the time. Echols disputed these claims, stating that Detective Ridge's account of their earlier unrecorded conversation was inaccurate, and in some instances, flatly untrue. Investigative journalist Mara Leverett, author of Devil's Knot, later argued that some of Echols' knowledge may have originated from police leaks circulating in the community, such as statements made by Detective Gitchell to one of the victims' fathers. The trial was further complicated by repeated attempts from the prosecution to introduce Echols' past violent behaviors into evidence, a strategy that the defense objected to but was ultimately overruled on. The combination of media attention, controversial testimony, and the shadow of alleged occult involvement cast a long, dark pall over the courtroom, leaving a sense of unease that lingered long after the verdicts were read. From the earliest days of the West Memphis case, questions were raised about the handling of the crime scene, and criticism of police procedures would grow louder over time. Jesse Miskelly Jr., as former attorney, Dan Stidham, painted a grim picture of mismanagement, describing the scene along Robin Hood Creek as literally trampled, especially the creek bed. According to Stidham, the boys' bodies had been removed from the water before the coroner could examine them properly, preventing an accurate determination of rigor mortis and leaving the remains exposed to sunlight, insects, and decay along the creek bank. Further errors compounded the scene's mishandling. Police did not notify the coroner until nearly 2 hours after the discovery of a floating shoe, delaying the official examination. The creek itself was never drained or secured promptly, leaving potential evidence submerged and vulnerable. Sandbags were only deployed after the bodies were retrieved. Stidham would later call the coroner's investigation extremely substandard, noting that even small amounts of blood at the scene were never tested. Documentary evidence from HBO's Paradise Lost, The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, 1996, and Paradise Lost 2, Revelations 2000, reinforced these concerns, revealing that no blood was recovered at the site where the bodies were found. This raised the possibility that the boys may have been killed elsewhere, and that the creek was only where their bodies were discarded. In the chaos following the initial discovery, law enforcement also failed to control the flow of information, allowing speculation and rumor about the crime scene to circulate freely among the public. The combination of procedural errors, lost or ignored evidence, and mismanagement of information left lingering questions about the integrity of the investigation and fueled doubt about the conclusions drawn by authorities. Investigative journalist Mara Leverett later painted a damning portrait of the West Memphis Police Department's handling of the case. She described the official records as chaotic, stating that to call them disorderly would be putting it mildly. Leverett suggested that the small local force had been overwhelmed by a crime of unprecedented severity in their community. Offers of assistance from Arkansas State Police experts in violent crime were refused, a decision critics speculated was influenced by the WMPD itself being under investigation for suspected theft from the Crittenden County Drug Task Force. Evidence storage was equally troubling. Some items were kept in ordinary supermarket paper sacks, rather than secure, standardized containers, raising questions about contamination or mismanagement. Speculation about potential suspects seeped into official commentary. A juvenile probation officer present at the scene suggested that Damian Eccles looked capable of committing the murders, remarking, "It looks like Damian Eccles finally killed someone." Meanwhile, questions about the forensic evidence further muddied the waters. Brent Turvey, a forensic scientist and criminal profiler, later noted in Paradise Lost 2 that photographs taken at the scene suggested the presence of human bite marks on at least one of the victims. Yet these possible marks were not formally examined by a board-certified medical examiner until 4 years after the murders. Defense experts testified that the marks could not have been made by an adult, while state experts insisted no bite marks existed at all. Subsequent review, including detailed photographic analysis and physical examination, concluded that even if the marks were bites, they could not be linked to any of the 3 convicted teenagers. The combination of disordered records, mishandled evidence, delayed forensic analysis, and unchecked speculation created a sense of chaos surrounding the investigation. Every misstep, real or perceived, cast a shadow over the case, leaving lingering doubts about the integrity of the evidence and the fairness of the trials that would forever define the West Memphis Three. The story of the West Memphis Three did not end with their convictions. In fact, it was only the beginning of a long, winding battle through the courts. In May 1994, the 3 young men launched appeals of their convictions, hoping to overturn the sentences handed down in the shadow of a highly controversial trial. Yet their efforts were met with resistance, and the direct appeals were upheld, leaving them to continue their fight through the legal system. By June 1996, Jesse Miskelly Jr.'s attorney, Dan Stidham, was preparing an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, seeking a higher-level review of what many considered a flawed process. More than a decade later, in 2007, Damian Eccles took a bold step, petitioning for a retrial based on advances in DNA testing that had emerged since the original investigation. The hope was that modern forensic technology could uncover evidence of innocence previously hidden, perhaps proving that the 3 men had been wrongfully convicted. Initially, the request was denied by Judge David Burnett, who refused to allow the presentation of this new scientific information in court. The ruling seemed like yet another dead end, but it would not hold. On November 4, 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court overturned the previous decision regarding all 3 defendants, opening the door to a new chapter in a case that had long been steeped in controversy, doubt, and the lingering possibility of justice finally being served. In 1993, a curious and controversial piece of evidence emerged in the West Memphis case. A folding hunting knife belonging to John Mark Byers, the adoptive father of victim Christopher Byers. Byers handed the knife to cameraman Doug Cooper, who was working with documentary filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky while shooting Paradise Lost. The knife, manufactured by Kershaw, soon became a focal point of speculation. Cooper reportedly received it on December 19, 1993, and after the crew returned to New York, Berlinger and Sinofsky noticed what appeared to be blood on the blade. HBO executives, concerned about chain of custody issues, instructed the filmmakers to return the knife to the West Memphis Police Department, which did not receive it until January 8, 1994. Byers initially insisted that the knife had never been used. Once the apparent blood was discovered, he amended his statement, claiming he had only used it once to cut deer meat. When informed that the blood matched the type shared by both himself and his son, Byers professed ignorance as to how it could have ended up on the knife. During questioning, police suggested he might have left it out accidentally, a possibility Byers conceded. He later speculated that he may have cut his thumb while handling it. Further forensic testing proved inconclusive. The tiny sample of blood, combined with the fact that both John Mark and Christopher shared the same HLA-DQ alpha genotype, meant that no definitive conclusions could be drawn about the knife's role in the murders. During filming of Paradise Lost 2, Revelations, Byers agreed to take a polygraph test regarding the murders and past, but the documentary noted that he was under the influence of multiple prescription medications at the time, raising questions about the reliability of the results. The knife, like much of the West Memphis case, became a symbol of ambiguity and uncertainty, a piece of evidence wrapped in suspicion but never providing the clarity investigators, the families, or the public desperately sought. In the years following their convictions, Damian Eccles, Jesse Miskelly Jr., and Jason Baldwin were asked to provide dental impressions, which were then compared to mysterious marks found on the forehead of victim Stevie Branch, marks that had never been mentioned in the original autopsy reports or introduced during the trial. The results offered no matches, leaving the question of the forehead markings unresolved. Meanwhile, John Mark Byers, Christopher's adoptive father, had his teeth removed in 1997 after the first trial, but before any imprint could be taken from him for comparison. His explanations for the extraction were inconsistent. He alternately attributed the removal to periodontal disease caused by seizure medication and to long-standing dental problems that had troubled him for years. The timing and circumstances of the procedure only added to the lingering uncertainty and suspicion surrounding the case. Complicating matters further, an expert reviewing autopsy photographs noticed what appeared to be the imprint of a belt buckle on Stevie Branch's body. When questioned by police, John Mark Byers admitted that he had spanked his stepson shortly before the boy disappeared, a revelation that introduced yet another layer of ambiguity to a case already shrouded in unanswered questions and shadows of doubt. Each new detail, from the teeth to the markings, underscored how fragile and incomplete the investigation had been, leaving investigators and the public alike grasping for certainty in a case dominated by speculation and fear. Years after the convictions, the West Memphis case continued to unravel in unexpected ways. In October 2003, Vicky Hutchison, whose statements had played a significant role in the arrests of Jesse Miskelly Jr., Damian Eccles, and Jason Baldwin, gave a startling interview to the Arkansas Times. She admitted that every detail she had provided to the police had been fabricated. Hutchison explained that officers had pressured her to cooperate, implying that her child could be taken away if she refused. She described a disturbing scene at the police station where photographs of Eccles, Baldwin, and Miskelly were mounted on the walls and used as targets for darts. She also revealed that an audio tape the police had claimed was unintelligible and that they had ultimately lost was in fact perfectly clear and contained no incriminating statements. Her recantation cast a long shadow over the earlier investigation, calling into question much of the evidence that had helped secure the convictions. By 2007, advances in forensic science provided another avenue to examine the case. DNA testing of material collected from the crime scene yielded no matches to Eccles, Baldwin, or Miskelly. Among the recovered evidence, a hair was found intertwined in the knots used to bind one of the victims, a hair described as not inconsistent with Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of victim Stevie Branch. Though prosecutors insisted that their convictions of the three men were valid, new details began to emerge that complicated the narrative. Pamela Hobbs, Stevie's mother, submitted a declaration noting that a knife her son had cherished, one that he carried constantly, was later found in Terry Hobbs's possession, despite having gone missing from the scene of the murder. She also reported witnessing Terry wash clothing, bed linens, and curtains from Stevie's room at suspicious times around the period of the murders. Additional evidence discovered in 2007, though not fully detailed, further deepened the uncertainties surrounding the case. By 2013, the court received written statement from two men, Billy Wayne Stewart and Benny Guy, both claiming they had information linking Terry Hobbs to the murders, information that had been overlooked or ignored by police in the early stages of the investigation. Each revelation added layers of doubt and suspense, underscoring how the original investigation may have been clouded by error, oversight, and the rush to judgment. The story of the West Memphis Three had grown from shocking crime to a complex tale of questionable evidence, coerced testimony, and lingering mysteries that haunted both the families and the community. In July 2008, a startling revelation shook the already tumultuous West Memphis case. Kent Arnold, the jury foreman during the Damian Eccles and Jason Baldwin trial, was discovered to have discussed the case with an attorney before deliberations even began. Allegations surfaced that Arnold had not only advocated for the guilt of the defendants, but also shared knowledge of inadmissible evidence, including statements made by Jesse Miskelly Jr. with fellow jurors. Legal experts immediately noted that such misconduct could provide grounds for overturning the convictions of Baldwin and Eccles, casting a shadow of uncertainty over the verdicts that had seemed final for more than a decade. A few months later, in September 2008, further scrutiny emerged during a post-conviction relief hearing. Daniel Stidham, the attorney who had represented Miskelly in 1994 and later became a judge, testified under oath about serious irregularities that had occurred during the trial. Stidham recounted overhearing Judge David Burnett communicate with the jury inappropriately while deliberations were underway. He described how the judge discussed taking a lunch break with the foreman, to which the foreman responded that the jury was nearly finished. Burnett allegedly remarked, "You'll need food for when you come back for sentencing," leaving the foreman to ask what would happen if the defendants were acquitted. The judge then closed the door without providing an answer, a moment that Stidham argued was a significant breach of judicial protocol. Stidham also admitted that he had failed to place this incident on the official court record at the time and acknowledged that his own performance had not met the minimum standards required by state law for representing a defendant in a capital murder case. These admissions, he contended, were clear evidence of ineffective assistance of counsel, warranting that Miss Skelly's conviction be vacated. The revelations fueled a growing perception that the trials have been plagued by procedural missteps, juror bias, and lapses in legal representation, reinforcing the chilling reality that the pursuit of justice in West Memphis had been anything but straightforward. Years after the West Memphis Three were convicted, new evidence and renewed legal efforts began to turn the case on its head. On October 29, 2007, Damian Eccles' defense team filed a dramatic petition in federal court, demanding either a retrial or his immediate release from prison. The filing introduced startling DNA evidence that suggested Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of one of the victims, might be connected to the crime scene. The petition also included fresh statements from Hobbs's former wife, adding more layers of suspicion to a case that had long been considered closed. Expert testimony was submitted to challenge key aspects of the original trial, including the claim that injuries found on the victims, most notably the mutilation of Christopher Byers, had been deliberately inflicted. The new experts argued that these wounds were more likely caused by animal activity after the bodies were dumped, throwing the prosecution's narrative of ritualistic violence into doubt. Despite the compelling nature of the new evidence, the initial response from the courts was not favorable. On September 10, 2008, Circuit Court Judge David Burnett denied the request for a retrial, dismissing the DNA findings as inconclusive and leaving the convictions intact. Undeterred, Eccles' legal team appealed the decision, and the case was elevated to the Arkansas Supreme Court. Oral arguments were heard on September 30, 2010, in a courtroom tense with anticipation. The hearings represented a critical turning point, as the legal system was forced to confront the possibility that new science, overlooked evidence, and decades of procedural errors might finally alter the course of a story long dominated by suspicion, fear, and the shadows of wrongful conviction. After nearly 2 decades of legal battles, twists, and lingering doubts, the West Memphis Three were finally on the verge of a resolution. On November 4, 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court issued a landmark decision, directing a lower court to examine whether newly analyzed DNA evidence could potentially exonerate Damian Eccles, Jesse Miskelly Jr., and Jason Baldwin. The justices also called for scrutiny of possible misconduct by the jurors who had sentenced Eccles to death and Miskelly and Baldwin to life imprisonment, acknowledging the long-standing concerns over bias and procedural errors that had haunted the case since the 1990s. With Circuit Court Judge David Burnett transitioning to the Arkansas State Senate in early December 2010, the task of overseeing the evidentiary hearings fell to Circuit Court Judge David Laser. The stage was set for a dramatic reassessment of a case that had gripped the nation with its dark combination of tragedy, controversy, and allegations of injustice. Weeks of tense negotiations followed, culminating on August 19, 2011, in an unprecedented resolution. Eccles, Baldwin, and Miskelly were released from prison under a carefully crafted plea agreement, rendering the evidentiary hearings unnecessary. Each man entered an Alford plea, a legal arrangement allowing them to assert their innocence while acknowledging that prosecutors had sufficient evidence to secure convictions. Stephen Braga, a dedicated attorney who had taken up Eccles' defense pro bono in 2009, successfully negotiated the deal with prosecutors, navigating the delicate balance between law, justice, and public scrutiny. Under the terms of the agreement, Judge Laser vacated all previous convictions, including the capital murder sentences, and ordered a new trial that ultimately never took place. The three men entered their Alford pleas to lesser charges of first and second-degree murder, while consistently asserting their innocence. Judge Laser sentenced them to time served, a total of 18 years and 78 days, and imposed a suspended sentence of 10 years, meaning that if any of them were to reoffend, they could face up to 21 years in prison. The release marked the end of a legal nightmare that had spanned nearly 2 decades, providing a bittersweet closure to a story of wrongful conviction, flawed investigations, and the enduring pursuit of justice. Even after their release, the legal and public ramifications of the West Memphis 3 case continued to ripple through Arkansas and beyond. Prosecutor Scott Ellington explained his reasoning for agreeing to the plea deal, citing several factors that tipped the balance. 2 of the victims' families had aligned themselves with the defense, expressing doubts about the original convictions. The mother of a key witness, whose earlier testimony had implicated Damian Eccles, had begun questioning her own daughter's credibility. Adding to the uncertainty, the state crime laboratory employee responsible for collecting fiber evidence at the homes of Eccles and Baldwin after their arrests had passed away, complicating the prospects of retrial as part of the unusual agreement. The 3 men were barred from pursuing civil lawsuits against the state for wrongful imprisonment, a condition that left some supporters frustrated. The plea deal itself sparked debate and even anger among both those who believed the men were innocent and those who remained convinced of their guilt. In 2011, advocates for the West Memphis 3 petitioned Arkansas Governor Mike Beebe to issue a pardon, arguing that their innocence had been proven. Beebe, however, insisted that he would not grant a pardon without concrete evidence identifying the true perpetrator. Ellington assured the public that the state crime lab would assist in searching for potential alternative suspects by running any DNA evidence from private tests through the FBI's combined DNA index system database. Despite agreeing to the plea, he admitted that if the case were retried under present conditions, the defendants would likely be acquitted due to the skill of their legal team, the loss of evidence over time, and the changed positions of several key witnesses. His comments underscored a sobering reality. The extraordinary plea deal was not just a resolution of legal technicalities. It was a recognition that the original trial had been fraught with flaws, and that the pursuit of justice in West Memphis had been far from straightforward. Even after the release of the West Memphis 3, the aftermath of the case continued to cast long shadows over the families of the victims and law enforcement alike. Opinions among the families of the slain boys remained divided, reflecting the complexity and emotional weight of the tragedy. In 2000, Rick Murray, the biological father of Christopher Byers, publicly expressed doubts about the convictions, signaling that even those closest to the victims questioned the official narrative. Years later, in 2007, Pamela Hobbs, mother of Stevie Branch, added her voice to the growing chorus of skepticism, calling for a thorough re-examination of the evidence and a reopening of the case. That same year, John Mark Byers, long a staunch believer in the guilt of Eccles, Miskelly, and Baldwin, made a startling announcement that he now believed the 3 men were innocent. If it were ever proven the 3 were innocent, I'd be the first to lead the charge for their freedom, Byers told the media. He took every opportunity to publicly advocate for justice, emphasizing that both the victims' families and the wrongfully convicted deserved recognition and truth. The ripple effects of the case extended even into the realm of popular culture. In 2010, Judge Brian S. Miller ruled against Terry Hobbs, stepfather of Stevie Branch, in a defamation lawsuit he had filed against the singer Natalie Maines of the Chicks, ordering him to pay $17,590 in legal costs. Miller noted that Hobbs had voluntarily involved himself in public discourse regarding the case, and in doing so, subjected himself to scrutiny for alleged links to the tragedy. Criminal experts also weighed in on the nature of the crime. John E. Douglas, a former FBI agent and veteran criminal profiler, analyzed the killings and concluded that they bore the mark of a single perpetrator rather than a group of inexperienced teenagers. Douglas noted that the crime seemed calculated to degrade and punish the victims, with a perpetrator likely familiar with both the victims and the local area. He emphasized that there was no credible evidence linking the murders to satanic rituals, and suggested that post-mortem animal activity could explain what had previously been interpreted as deliberate mutilation. According to Douglas, the victims had likely died from a combination of blunt force trauma and drowning in a violent act driven by personal motives, rather than the ritualistic narrative that had dominated headlines for years. The convergence of shifting family perspectives, expert analyses, and legal reconsiderations highlighted the enduring complexity of the West Memphis 3 case. What had once seemed like a straightforward prosecution now appeared fraught with uncertainty, revealing a story where justice, doubt, and tragedy remained deeply intertwined.